young prophet, and a nation living on borrowed time. Jerusalem was still standing. The temple still crowned the hill of Zion. Priests still carried out their duties. Sacrifices still burned on the altar. The descendants of David still occupied the throne, and to anyone looking at Judah from the outside, the kingdom might have appeared wounded but secure. Yet beneath that appearance, something was terribly wrong. For generations, Judah had lived between covenant and rebellion, worship and compromise, warning and refusal. Kings had risen and fallen. Idols had entered places where the worship of the God of Israel was supposed to stand alone. Injustice had spread through the land. Foreign powers were shifting beyond Judah's borders, and the political order that had dominated the ancient Near East was beginning to crack. Into this world came a young man from a small town northeast of Jerusalem. His name was Jeremiah. He would live long enough to see kings ignore him, priests oppose him, false prophets contradict him, officials imprison him, and his own people accuse him of betraying the nation he desperately wanted to save. He would warn Jerusalem that its walls could fall. He would warn Judah that possessing the temple did not make the nation untouchable. He would speak of an enemy coming from the north, when many still believed disaster could be avoided, and eventually Jeremiah would stand amid the consequences of everything he had spent decades warning against. But this raises the question at the heart of his story. How can a nation receive warning after warning and still continue toward destruction? And what does a prophet do when faithfulness to God requires him to tell his own people something they refuse to hear? To understand Jeremiah, we must begin before Jerusalem burned, before Babylon broke through its walls, and before the people of Judah were carried into exile. We must begin when there was still time. Jeremiah came from Anathoth, a town in the territory of Benjamin, only a few miles from Jerusalem. He was the son of Hilkiah and belonged to a priestly family. The biblical text does not give us a detailed account of his childhood, and it does not tell us everything about his family's place within the priesthood. What it does tell us is enough to locate Jeremiah near the religious life of Judah, while still placing him outside the immediate center of Jerusalem. That location mattered. Jerusalem was close enough to dominate the horizon of his world, but Anathoth was not Jerusalem. Jeremiah would spend much of his ministry confronting the assumptions of the capital, while carrying the perspective of someone whose roots lay beyond its walls. His prophetic ministry began during the reign of Josiah, king of Judah, and to understand why that moment was so important, we need to understand the kingdom Jeremiah inherited. More than a century earlier, the united monarchy associated with David and Solomon had fractured. After Solomon's death, the northern tribes formed the kingdom commonly called Israel, while the southern kingdom of Judah remained centered on Jerusalem under the Davidic dynasty. The northern kingdom eventually fell to Assyria in the 8th century BC. Samaria was conquered. Large numbers of people were displaced. The political kingdom of Israel in the north ceased to exist. Judah survived. But survival created its own temptation. Jerusalem had escaped catastrophes that had destroyed others. The temple remained. The Davidic dynasty remained. The city had endured the terrifying Assyrian crisis during the reign of Hezekiah. It was possible to look at that history and draw a dangerous conclusion. Jerusalem will always survive. But the prophets of Judah repeatedly challenged that assumption. The presence of sacred institutions did not cancel covenant responsibility. A temple could not turn injustice into righteousness. Religious ceremonies could not make rebellion harmless. The city associated with David was not given permission to become indifferent to the God David worshipped. And before Jeremiah's ministry began, Judah had passed through one of the darkest reigns in its history. King Manasseh had ruled for decades. The biblical accounts associate his reign with extensive idolatry, occult practices, violence, and religious corruption. His son Amon continued in rebellion before being assassinated. Then the throne passed to a boy, Josiah. He was only 8 years old when he became king. No one looking at a child on Judah's throne could have known how dramatically his reign would reshape the religious landscape of the kingdom. Josiah eventually became remembered as one of Judah's most faithful reforming kings. He rejected the idolatrous practices associated with previous reigns. He sought the God of David. He ordered the removal of pagan worship sites. And during repairs to the temple, a discovery was made that would shake the royal court. The book of the law was found. When its words were read before Josiah, the king tore his clothes. He understood that Judah had not been living faithfully according to the covenant. This was not merely the discovery of an old religious document. In the biblical narrative, it became a moment of national confrontation. Judah was forced to hear again the standards it had neglected. Josiah responded with urgency. He gathered the people. The covenant was publicly renewed. Idolatrous objects were removed. Pagan priests were dealt with. Unauthorized worship sites were destroyed. The Passover was observed on a remarkable scale. From the outside, it looked like revival. And somewhere during this same broad era, Jeremiah began to speak. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of Josiah's reign. Jeremiah's first response was not confidence, it was inadequacy. He protested that he did not know how to speak because he was young. Scripture does not give his precise age, so we should not imagine a number the text never provides. What matters is how Jeremiah understood himself. He did not see himself as an obvious national spokesman. He did not present himself as a powerful figure waiting for an audience. He felt unprepared. The calling answered that fear with a claim far larger than Jeremiah's sense of limitation. Before Jeremiah had been formed in the womb, God knew him. Before his birth, he had been set apart. He was appointed as a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah's life, in other words, was about to become something he had not designed for himself. He would not be permitted to hide behind youth. He would not be allowed to choose only comfortable messages, and he would not speak merely to reassure Judah that everything would be fine. The message placed in his mouth would have consequences. Jeremiah was appointed to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. Those paired images summarize much of his entire ministry. Destruction and construction, judgment and restoration, uprooting and planting. Jeremiah would become famous for announcing catastrophe, but catastrophe was never the whole message. Even from the beginning, judgment existed alongside the possibility of rebuilding. Yet before anything could be rebuilt, Jeremiah would have to expose what was already rotten. His first recorded visions immediately established the tone. He saw the branch of an almond tree. In Hebrew, the imagery involves a wordplay between the almond tree and the idea of watching. The vision communicated that God was watching over his word to perform it. The warning Jeremiah carried would not disappear simply because people refused to believe it. Then came a second vision. Jeremiah saw a boiling pot tilting from the north. The image was ominous. Disaster would be poured out from the north upon the inhabitants of the land. At the beginning of Jeremiah's ministry, the exact historical shape of everything to come had not yet unfolded before Judah. Empires were shifting. Assyria, once the terror of the region, was weakening. Egypt still sought influence. Babylon was rising. Jeremiah's prophetic imagery placed Judah inside a much larger storm. The kingdom could debate policy. Kings could negotiate alliances. Officials could calculate military strength. But Jeremiah insisted that the deepest crisis was not diplomatic, it was covenantal. Judah's problem was not simply that stronger empires existed. Its problem was that the nation had repeatedly turned away from the God with whom it claimed covenant relationship. Jeremiah described this betrayal using language that was deeply personal. Israel's relationship with God was not portrayed merely as a broken political contract. Jeremiah spoke in images of devotion, marriage, infidelity, thirst, and abandoned fountains. The people had forsaken the fountain of living waters and dug broken cisterns that could hold no water. It was an unforgettable picture. Imagine someone walking away from a flowing spring in order to carve reservoirs into stone, only to discover that the reservoirs are cracked. That, Jeremiah argued, was Judah's spiritual condition. The nation had exchanged what gave life for what could not sustain it. And this was precisely what made Josiah's reforms so complicated. The reforms were real. The king's response was serious. The destruction of idolatrous sites mattered. The recovery of covenant teaching mattered. But national reform imposed from the throne was not necessarily identical to national repentance within the heart. A king could remove an idol from a shrine. He could not force every person to love God. A king could command the observance of covenant practices. He could not manufacture faithfulness inside an unwilling heart. This tension would become one of the defining realities of Jeremiah's ministry. Judah could look reformed while remaining spiritually unstable. The rituals could change faster than the people. Jeremiah saw beyond the surface. His language repeatedly called Judah to return. Return. That word carried both warning and invitation. The prophet was not announcing destruction because he enjoyed condemning his nation. The urgency of his message existed precisely because the relationship had not become meaningless. Judah's unfaithfulness mattered because the covenant mattered. Jeremiah called the people to break up their unplowed ground rather than sow among thorns. He urged them to circumcise their hearts, to deal not merely with outward religious identity, but with the inward resistance that made genuine obedience impossible. The imagery was severe because the danger was severe. Something was approaching. From the north, Jeremiah described alarm trumpet blasts, destruction advancing forces. At times, his prophetic language seems to place the audience almost inside the coming catastrophe. Banners rising, cities threatened, people fleeing toward fortified places. Yet the disaster had not fully arrived. That gap between warning and fulfillment is essential to understanding the story. Prophetic warning exists in time. There is a moment when the city is still standing, a moment when the gates are still open, a moment when fields are still cultivated, a moment when ordinary life continues. And because ordinary life continues, warning can sound exaggerated. That is one of the great tensions of Jeremiah. He spoke about collapse while people could still walk through Jerusalem. He spoke about invasion while Judah still had a king. He spoke about judgment while worship still continued at the temple. He saw the destination while the nation was still traveling the road. And Jeremiah himself was not emotionally detached from what he saw. This would not be the story of a cold prophet standing at a distance, satisfied to be proven right. Jeremiah's words reveal a man profoundly affected by his mission. He would grieve, he would question, he would lament. At times, he would wish he had never been born. At other times, he would want to stop speaking only to find that the message within him could not simply be suppressed. This is part of why later tradition remembers him so strongly as the weeping prophet. But tears should not be mistaken for weakness. Jeremiah's ministry required extraordinary endurance. It is easy to speak when an audience applauds. It is much harder to continue when the message makes you hated. Jeremiah would eventually discover how costly his calling really was. For now, however, Josiah still ruled, and Judah was undergoing reform. This creates one of the first great paradoxes in Jeremiah's story. If Judah had a righteous, reforming king, why was judgment still approaching? The answer reaches backward into generations of accumulated rebellion and forward into what would happen after Josiah. The biblical account of Kings presents Josiah with remarkable praise, yet it also states that the judgment associated with Judah's long history of sin, especially the legacy attributed to Manasseh, had not simply vanished. This does not mean Josiah's faithfulness was meaningless. Quite the opposite. His life demonstrates that personal and national faithfulness still mattered, even when consequences created by previous generations had become enormous. But reform came late in Judah's history, and beneath the reform loyalties remained divided. Jeremiah's preaching exposed that division. People could speak religious language while continuing injustice. They could invoke God while trusting other powers. They could participate in worship while their lives contradicted the covenant they claimed to honor. Jeremiah's message, therefore, reached beyond idols made from wood or stone. The deeper idol was false security. Judah trusted things that could not save it: foreign alliances, religious appearances, national identity. The temple itself, when treated as a guarantee rather than a place of faithful worship. That final illusion would eventually bring Jeremiah into one of the most dangerous confrontations of his life. But before that confrontation came a political shock. Josiah went north to confront Pharaoh Necho of Egypt near Megiddo. The biblical accounts describe the event with different emphases, but they agree on the devastating result. Josiah was killed. The reforming king was gone. For Judah, this was more than the death of a ruler. The man who had spent years dismantling idolatrous structures and restoring covenant worship disappeared from the stage at a moment when the international world was becoming increasingly dangerous. Jeremiah lamented Josiah. The kingdom mourned, and suddenly the future looked different. Josiah's death exposed something his reign had partially concealed. Judah's reform had depended heavily on a faithful king. What would happen when the king was no longer there? The answer came quickly. Josiah's son Jehoahaz became king, but his reign lasted only 3 months. Pharaoh Necho removed him, imposed tribute on Judah, and placed another son of Josiah on the throne. His name was Eliakim. Necho changed his name to Jehoiakim. Even that act revealed Judah's new political reality. The kingdom of David still possessed a throne, but foreign powers could now determine who sat upon it. Judah had entered a dangerous age of dependency. Egypt pressed from one direction. Babylon was rising from another. Assyria's old order was collapsing. And inside Jerusalem, leaders still had to decide whether Jeremiah's warnings represented the word of God or the pessimism of a troublesome prophet. Jehoiakim would make his choice. Where Josiah had torn his clothes after hearing the recovered words of the law, Jehoiakim would eventually respond to Jeremiah's words very differently. He would take a scroll containing prophetic warnings, cut it piece by piece, and throw it into the fire. The contrast could hardly be greater. One king heard warning and humbled himself. Another would hear warning and try to destroy the message. And between those two kings stood Jeremiah. The young prophet from Anathoth was no longer speaking into an age of reform. He was entering an age of resistance. The storm from the north was no longer merely an image in a vision. Babylon was becoming the dominant power of the region. The political space around Judah was narrowing. The moral crisis inside Judah was deepening. And soon Jeremiah would stand at the very gate of the temple and attack one of the most comforting beliefs in Jerusalem, that because God's house stood among them, the city itself could never fall. That message would nearly cost him his life. Judah still had walls. It still had priests. It still had sacrifices. It still had a king from David's line. But the death of Josiah had removed the strongest barrier holding back the kingdom's old patterns. A generation had been given reform. Now it would reveal whether reform had reached the heart. And as Jeremiah watched a new king take the throne under the shadow of Egypt, the warning that had begun with a boiling pot became increasingly difficult to ignore. Something was coming from the north. The tragedy was that Judah would spend precious years refusing to believe it. Reform deception and the message Judah did not want to hear. Josiah was dead. The king who had torn his clothes when the book of the law was read before him was gone. And Judah now entered a period of instability that would reveal just how shallow much of the nation's reform had been. For years, idols had been removed. Unauthorized shrines had been destroyed. The Passover had been restored. The covenant had been publicly renewed. But Jeremiah had always understood that external reform could not guarantee internal faithfulness. The death of Josiah exposed the difference. Jehoahaz, one of Josiah's sons, was placed on the throne. His reign lasted only 3 months. Egypt intervened. Pharaoh Necho removed him and carried him away. Another son of Josiah, Eliakim, was installed as king, and his name was changed to Jehoiakim. Judah was no longer acting like an independent kingdom with full control over its own future. Foreign powers were deciding who would rule. Tribute was being demanded. The great empires surrounding Judah were tightening their grip. But while political pressure increased from outside, Jeremiah turned his attention to the deeper crisis inside the nation. The people still had Jerusalem. They still had the temple, and that temple had become one of the greatest sources of false confidence in Judah. It was possible to look at the sanctuary, remember the covenant, remember the promises associated with David, remember how Jerusalem had survived earlier invasions, and conclude that this city could never truly be destroyed. Jeremiah was about to confront that belief directly. He stood at the gate of the Lord's house. Worshippers were entering. Sacrifices were being offered. Religious activity continued. And Jeremiah delivered a message so offensive that it would turn priests, prophets, and citizens against him. He called the people to amend their ways. He challenged them not to trust deceptive words. Do not assume that repeating the phrase, "the temple of the Lord," will protect you while your lives contradict the covenant. The issue was not the temple itself. The issue was what the people believed the temple guaranteed. Jeremiah accused Judah of injustice, oppression, violence, adultery, false worship. He described people committing evil and then entering the house associated with God's name as though the building made them safe. His point was devastating. Sacred space does not turn rebellion into obedience. Religious activity cannot be used as insurance against moral collapse. To make the warning even more shocking, Jeremiah pointed backward in Israel's history. He told them to remember Shiloh. Long before Solomon's temple stood in Jerusalem, Shiloh had been a major center of Israel's worship. The tabernacle had been associated with that place. Yet Shiloh had not been protected simply because it carried sacred significance. Jeremiah's implication was unmistakable. If Shiloh could fall, Jerusalem could fall. If an earlier sanctuary could be judged, the present temple could not be treated as untouchable. For people whose national and religious identity was centered on Jerusalem, this sounded almost unbearable. The temple was more than a building. It was linked with history, priesthood, sacrifice, kingship, memory, national identity. Jeremiah was not merely criticizing bad behavior. He was attacking the illusion that possession of sacred institutions guaranteed divine protection, regardless of covenant faithfulness. That is why the reaction was so intense. When Jeremiah finished speaking, priests, prophets, and people seized him. The accusation was simple. He had prophesied against the city. He had said Jerusalem could become like Shiloh. Why should he not die? The scene reveals how dangerous Jeremiah's ministry had become. He was not speaking from the safety of private reflection. He was confronting the central religious establishment of Judah at the heart of Jerusalem. Officials arrived. A public dispute followed. The priests and prophets argued that Jeremiah deserved death because of what he had spoken against the city. Jeremiah did not withdraw the message. He did not soften it merely because his life was threatened. He insisted that he had been sent to speak these words. Then he did something crucial. He again called the people to change. Amend your ways. The warning still carried an invitation. Judgment had not been announced as a theatrical threat. The purpose of the warning was repentance. Jeremiah even placed his own life in their hands. As for me, he said in effect, I am in your power. Do with me as you think good and right. But if you kill me, understand what you are doing. You will bring innocent blood upon yourselves and upon this city, because the Lord truly sent me to speak these words. That moment reveals a central truth about Jeremiah's courage. He did not survive because he was fearless in the modern sense. His own writings show profound emotional pain. He survived because his fear did not become stronger than his obedience. Some officials and elders resisted the demand for his execution. They remembered another prophet from the past. Micah had prophesied during the reign of Hezekiah that Zion would be plowed like a field and Jerusalem reduced to ruins. Hezekiah had not killed Micah. He had feared the Lord. The nation had responded differently. The elders argued that executing Jeremiah for delivering a warning could bring even greater disaster upon them. Jeremiah's life was spared, for the moment. But another prophet was not so fortunate. The book of Jeremiah records the case of Uriah, son of Shemaiah, who also prophesied against Jerusalem and Judah in a manner similar to Jeremiah. King Jehoiakim sought to kill him. Uriah fled to Egypt. But agents of Jehoiakim pursued him, brought him back, and the king had him executed. His body was cast into a common burial place. The message was clear. Jeremiah lived in a kingdom where prophetic opposition could be fatal. The survival of Jeremiah should therefore never be confused with safety. He ministered under kings who could order a man's death because they did not like what he had prophesied. And Jehoiakim was very different from his father. Josiah had responded to covenant warning by humbling himself. Jehoiakim would become known for pride, injustice, and resistance. Jeremiah confronted him not only for religious compromise, but also for how royal power was being used. The prophet denounced a king who built grand structures while exploiting workers. He contrasted Jehoiakim with Josiah. Josiah had exercised justice and righteousness. He defended the cause of the poor and needy. That Jeremiah argued was part of what it meant to truly know God. This was another uncomfortable truth. Biblical faithfulness was not being measured merely by ceremony. Justice mattered. How rulers treated people mattered. How wealth was acquired mattered. Royal architecture could not disguise corruption. Jeremiah's message pushed continually beneath appearances. A beautiful palace could hide injustice. A magnificent temple could hide rebellion. A national identity could hide spiritual collapse. And all the while, the international world was changing with remarkable speed. Assyria, once the dominant empire of the region, was crumbling. Its great cities were falling. The empire that had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and threatened Judah for generations was disappearing. At first, Judah might have imagined that Assyria's collapse would create freedom. Instead, it created a struggle between larger powers. Egypt attempted to extend influence northward. Babylon rose from Mesopotamia, and the decisive collision came at Carchemish. Nebuchadnezzar, crown prince of Babylon and later king, defeated the Egyptian forces. The balance of power shifted. Babylon was no longer a distant kingdom. It was becoming the controlling power of the region. This gave Jeremiah's earlier warning new historical force. The danger from the north was taking a recognizable political shape. Judah now existed in the shadow of Babylon. Yet the temptation of Judah's rulers was not primarily to ask whether they should repent. It was to ask which empire they should trust. Babylon rebellion, alliance, tribute, military calculation consumed the political imagination. Jeremiah kept insisting that politics could not be separated from Judah's covenant crisis. No alliance could save a nation that refused correction. No strategic maneuver could cancel the consequences of persistent rebellion. This did not mean politics was irrelevant. It meant politics was not ultimate. Jeremiah's ministry increasingly brought him into conflict not only with kings, but also with other prophets. This is one of the most important dimensions of his story. Jeremiah was not simply a prophet speaking to people who had no religious guidance. He was competing with other religious voices. Some offered reassurance. Some promised peace. Some insisted disaster would not come. That made Jeremiah's message much harder to receive. If one prophet announces judgment, while another announces security, how does an ordinary person decide whom to believe? Jeremiah attacked prophets who spoke visions from their own minds while claiming divine authority. He condemned those who treated national wounds as though they were superficial. His criticism can be summarized in one of the most powerful ideas in the book. They heal the wound of the people lightly. They say peace, peace, when there is no peace. The image is medical. Imagine a deep wound requiring serious treatment. Instead of cleansing it, the physician covers it and tells the patient everything is fine. The reassurance feels better, but it is deadly. Jeremiah believed Judah was being treated that way spiritually. The nation had a deep wound. False reassurance was making it worse. This is why Jeremiah's message often sounded harsher than the messages around him. He was refusing to call a fatal condition harmless. And the conflict was not abstract. Jeremiah himself became a symbol of the message he carried. At one point, he was commanded not to marry or have children in that place. The reason was tied to the coming disaster. Ordinary family life itself became a prophetic sign. Jeremiah's personal future was being shaped by the catastrophe he announced. He did not merely preach the message, he lived inside it. The prophet's isolation deepened. He was not allowed to live as though Judah's future were normal. He could not build the same kind of domestic expectation that others around him might have taken for granted. This cost cannot be measured only in public persecution. There was private cost as well. Loneliness, restriction, emotional burden. Jeremiah would eventually speak of wishing that his eyes were a fountain of tears so he could weep continually for his people. That image helps explain why he became associated with weeping, but again, his grief did not weaken the warning. It strengthened its credibility. He did not announce destruction with pleasure. He grieved because he loved what was being destroyed. The city mattered to him, the people mattered, the covenant mattered, the temple mattered. If Jeremiah had hated Jerusalem, his warnings would have been easy. The tragedy was that he loved Jerusalem and still had to tell it the truth. This tension became especially visible through Jeremiah's symbolic actions. The prophets of Israel often used physical signs to make their messages impossible to ignore. Jeremiah did the same. One of the most memorable involved a linen belt or waistband. He obtained it, wore it, and later hid it near the Euphrates region, according to the prophetic instruction. When it was retrieved, it was ruined and useless. The symbol illustrated what Judah had been meant to be, close, bound, a source of praise and honor. But pride and refusal had made the people spiritually useless for the purpose they claimed to serve. Another sign involved the potter. Jeremiah went down to the potter's house. There he watched a craftsman shaping clay. When a vessel was spoiled in the potter's hand, the potter reshaped it into another vessel, as seemed right to him. The lesson concerned God's authority over nations. The image was not a simplistic claim that human choices were meaningless. In fact, the prophetic explanation emphasized response. If a nation warned of judgment turned from evil, the announced disaster could be reconsidered. If a nation promised good, turned toward evil, blessing could be withheld. The potter image, therefore, reinforced the seriousness of repentance. Judah's future was not being discussed as though moral decisions did not matter. The people were being warned precisely because response mattered. But Jeremiah then used an even more severe image. He took a clay jar, he gathered elders and priests. He went to the valley of Ben Hinnom near Jerusalem, a place associated in the prophetic tradition with horrifying practices and judgment. There Jeremiah announced disaster. Then he smashed the jar. The symbolism was unmistakable. A clay vessel can be reshaped while it is soft, but once fired and hardened, when shattered, it cannot simply be restored to its previous form. The nation was approaching a point where its persistent refusal would produce consequences no longer easily reversed. The priests and leaders could ignore sermons. A shattered jar was harder to forget. This kind of prophetic action made Jeremiah impossible to dismiss as a quiet religious critic. He was forcing the message into public consciousness, and public reaction grew more hostile. Pashhur, a priest and chief officer in the temple, heard Jeremiah's prophecies. He had Jeremiah beaten. Then he placed him in stocks. Imagine the scene. The prophet who had stood at the temple gate warning the people was now physically restrained within the religious complex itself. Public humiliation was part of the punishment. The next day, Pashhur released him. Jeremiah did not thank him and disappear. He gave him a prophetic name associated with terror on every side. The warning continued. This pattern would define Jeremiah's life. He would be opposed. He would suffer. He would speak again, but the cost was accumulating inside him. After this episode, Jeremiah poured out one of the most personal laments in prophetic literature. He spoke to God with startling honesty. He described himself as mocked. Everyone ridiculed him. Whenever he spoke, he had to cry out about violence and destruction. The word he carried had become a source of reproach. So Jeremiah tried to imagine silence. Perhaps he could stop. Perhaps he could simply refuse to mention the message anymore. But he could not. The word became like a fire shut up in his bones. He grew weary of holding it in. He was unable to contain it. That image explains Jeremiah better than the label weeping prophet alone ever could. He wept, but he also burned. His grief and his calling existed together. The message wounded him, yet he could not abandon it. His enemies watched him. Friends could become informants. People waited for him to stumble. Still, Jeremiah spoke. This is what prophetic faithfulness looked like in the final decades of Judah. Not standing above the crisis, standing inside it. The kingdom continued to function. Markets opened, officials debated, priests served, families lived. But beneath ordinary life, the pressure was rising. Babylon's victory had changed the political map. Jehoiakim was caught between submission and rebellion. Jeremiah's warnings became increasingly specific. The king of Babylon would become an instrument of judgment against Judah and surrounding nations. This would have sounded politically offensive. To describe a foreign conqueror as an instrument in divine judgment could easily be interpreted as disloyalty. But Jeremiah was not celebrating Babylon. Babylon itself would also face judgment. The point was not that Babylon was righteous. The point was that Judah could not assume its own rebellion carried no consequences simply because the invading empire was also wicked. History is often morally uncomfortable. Jeremiah refused simple categories in which Judah was automatically safe. because its enemies were worse. Judah was responsible for Judah. And then came an event that would expose Jehoiakim's heart with extraordinary clarity. Jeremiah was restricted from going to the house of the Lord. The text does not explain every detail of that restriction, but because Jeremiah could not deliver the message personally, he called Baruch son of Neriah. Baruch would become one of the most important people in Jeremiah's ministry. He was a scribe, a recorder, a companion. Jeremiah dictated the words he had received over the years, and Baruch wrote them on a scroll. The purpose was clear. Perhaps when Judah heard all the disasters announced against them, they would turn from evil. Again, the warning was meant to create an opportunity for repentance. Baruch took the scroll to the temple and read Jeremiah's words publicly. Eventually, officials heard about it. They summoned Baruch. He read the scroll to them. Their reaction was very different from casual dismissal. They became afraid. They understood that the king needed to hear these words. But first, they asked Baruch how the scroll had been written. Baruch explained that Jeremiah had dictated the words, and he had written them in ink. The officials told Baruch and Jeremiah to hide. They knew the danger. The scroll was then brought before Jehoiakim. It was winter. The king was sitting in his winter apartment. A fire burned in a brazier before him. The scroll was read. After several columns had been read, Jehoiakim took a knife. He cut off the section. Then he threw it into the fire. More was read. More was cut. More was burned. Piece by piece, Jeremiah's warnings disappeared into the flames. The contrast with Josiah is one of the most striking in Judah's history. Josiah heard the words of the covenant and tore his clothes. Jehoiakim heard prophetic warning and tore the scroll. Josiah feared what the words revealed. Jehoiakim attempted to destroy the words themselves. Those around him urged him not to burn the scroll. He refused. The king ordered the arrest of Jeremiah and Baruch. They were not found, but Jehoiakim had made his response unmistakable. He believed the message could be dealt with by destroying the document. It could not. Jeremiah dictated the scroll again. Baruch wrote it again. And the text tells us that many similar words were added. The fire had destroyed the parchment. It had not destroyed the warning. This moment became a symbolic turning point. Judah was no longer merely ignoring Jeremiah. Its king had dramatized rejection. He had literally fed the warning to the flames. But beyond Jerusalem, another fire was spreading. Babylonian power was expanding. Jehoiakim's political calculations were becoming more dangerous. The empire he might resist was the empire that had just defeated Egypt and inherited dominance over the region. Jeremiah's warning and the geopolitical reality were now moving toward the same point. The temple still stood. The king still sat on the throne. Jerusalem still had walls, but the illusion of safety was weakening. Soon Babylon would no longer be a distant name. Its armies would come. A king would be removed. Members of Judah's elite would be carried into exile, and in that crisis, another battle would begin. Not between Jeremiah and a king who burned scrolls, but between Jeremiah and prophets promising that the exile would be brief. For Judah, the most dangerous lie was becoming increasingly attractive, that everything lost would soon return to normal. The prophet against the king. By the time Jehoiakim burned Jeremiah's scroll, the conflict had become unmistakable. This was no longer a disagreement over tone. It was a struggle over which vision of Judah's future would prevail. The king believed he could manage the political crisis through calculation, force, and resistance. Jeremiah insisted that Judah's deepest problem could not be solved by strategy alone. The nation was heading toward judgment because it had refused correction for too long. And now Babylon was moving from threat to reality. Nebuchadnezzar had emerged as the dominant power in the region. The Assyrian Empire, which had once shaped the entire political world of Judah, was gone. Egypt had been pushed back. Babylon now controlled the routes and territories that surrounded Judah. Jehoiakim initially submitted to Babylon, but submission did not last. After several years, he rebelled. From a political perspective, the decision may have seemed to offer a chance at freedom. Kings in small states frequently tried to exploit moments of weakness or shifting alliances between larger empires. But Jeremiah viewed the rebellion differently. He had already warned that Judah's resistance to Babylon would not succeed. The issue was not that Babylon deserved loyalty. The issue was that Judah was trying to escape consequences without changing the behavior that had produced them. This distinction mattered. Jeremiah was not preaching admiration for Babylon, he was preaching realism about judgment. That made him extraordinarily unpopular. A prophet who tells a nation that victory is coming can be celebrated. A prophet who tells a nation that its chosen war cannot be won may be called a traitor. Jeremiah increasingly lived in that dangerous space. Babylonian pressure intensified. Raiding forces struck Judah. The kingdom's security eroded, and Jehoiakim's reign moved toward a grim end. The biblical accounts do not preserve every detail of his death in exactly the same way, and the circumstances should not be reconstructed with false certainty. What is clear is that his reign ended under the shadow of Babylon, and that his political defiance did not rescue Judah. His son Jehoiachin succeeded him, but by then the room for maneuver had nearly vanished. Jehoiachin was young when he became king, and his reign lasted only a few months before Babylonian forces surrounded Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar came against the city. This time, Judah could not pretend the danger was distant. The enemy Jeremiah had warned about was outside the walls. Jerusalem surrendered. Jehoiachin was taken captive. Members of the royal family were taken. Officials were taken. Warriors were taken. Craftsmen and skilled workers were deported. Temple treasures and royal treasures were carried away. The exile had begun. Jerusalem still stood. The temple had not yet been destroyed. But something fundamental had changed. A Davidic king had been removed and carried to Babylon. The elite of the nation had been displaced. The kingdom had survived, but only as a diminished political structure under Babylonian domination. Nebuchadnezzar placed another son of Josiah on the throne. His name was Mattaniah. The Babylonian king changed his name to Zedekiah. Once again, the renaming of a Judean king symbolized dependence. Judah still had a monarch. But everyone understood who held the greater power. Zedekiah would become the final king of Judah before the fall of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah would spend much of his reign trying to persuade him to accept a reality that almost everyone around him wanted to reject. But before that final confrontation, the first exile created a new problem. Hope. Not genuine hope grounded in repentance. False hope. Many in Judah wanted to believe the deportation was temporary. The temple still stood. Jerusalem still had a king. Surely the captives would return quickly. Surely the vessels taken from the temple would soon be restored. Surely Babylon's domination would collapse within a few years. This message was attractive because it allowed Judah to imagine restoration without transformation. No long exile. No deep reckoning. No painful acceptance of consequences. Just a short interruption before normal life returned. Jeremiah challenged that expectation. His message to the exiles was startling. He sent a letter to those who had been carried to Babylon. Instead of telling them to prepare for immediate return, he told them to build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry, raise families, seek the welfare of the city where they had been taken. Pray for it, because their exile would not be brief. This was one of the most difficult messages Jeremiah ever delivered. For a displaced population longing for home, the instructions sounded almost unbearable. Do not spend every day pretending you will leave tomorrow. You may be there for years. Build a life. Jeremiah also warned them not to listen to prophets and diviners promising a quick reversal. The people wanted to hear that Babylon was temporary. Jeremiah told them that exile had to run its course. Yet, even here, judgment was not the end of the message. The letter contained hope. After the appointed period, God would visit his people and bring them back. The future was not destroyed, it was delayed. This is a crucial difference. Jeremiah's theology of exile was not despair, it was disciplined hope. False prophets said, "You will be home immediately." Jeremiah said, in effect, "No, the exile is real. The consequences are real." But God has not abandoned his purposes. That kind of hope is harder. It requires accepting painful truth before receiving comfort. Jeremiah would repeatedly refuse comfort that was built on denial. And in Jerusalem, one man became the clearest embodiment of the competing message. His name was Hananiah, son of Azur. The confrontation between Jeremiah and Hananiah occurred in the temple. By this time, Jeremiah had been using another symbolic action. He wore a yoke. The wooden bars rested across his neck as a visible sign of submission to Babylon. The image was deliberately humiliating. A yoke belonged on an animal used for labor. For a prophet to walk through Jerusalem wearing one was a public declaration Judah must submit to the king of Babylon. Jeremiah extended the message beyond Judah. Envoys from surrounding kingdoms had come to Jerusalem, apparently connected to discussions about resistance. Edom, Moab, Ammon, Tyre, Sidon. These small states all faced the same enormous question. Could they unite and break Babylonian control? Jeremiah's answer was no. Do not rebel. Do not believe prophets who promise that Babylon will quickly disappear. Submit for now. Again, this would have sounded politically outrageous, but Jeremiah's message was based on a conviction that Babylon's current dominance existed within a larger divine judgment. Resistance would not cancel the judgment, it would deepen the destruction. Then Hananiah spoke. He announced a message in the name of the Lord. The yoke of Babylon would be broken. Within 2 years, the vessels taken from the temple would return. Jehoiakim and the other exiles would come back. The message was everything people wanted to hear. Short exile, national restoration, temple treasures returned, royal line restored, Babylon defeated. And Hananiah did not present it as personal optimism. He presented it as prophecy. This created one of the hardest questions in the entire story. Both men claimed to speak for God. Both used religious language. Both addressed the same political crisis. One said submission. The other said liberation. One said years of exile. The other said 2 years. How could the people know? Jeremiah's first response is remarkable. He did not react with personal rage. He said, in effect, Amen. May the Lord do what you have said. May the exiles return. May the temple vessels come back. Jeremiah wanted restoration. This matters. He did not oppose Hananiah because he enjoyed bad news. If Judah could have been restored immediately, Jeremiah would have rejoiced. But desire could not determine truth. Jeremiah then appealed to the history of prophecy. Prophets before them had often spoken of war, disaster, and pestilence against powerful nations. When a prophet announced peace fulfillment would demonstrate whether the message truly came from God. Hananiah responded dramatically. He took the wooden yoke from Jeremiah's neck, and he broke it. Before the people, the symbol of Babylonian domination shattered. Then Hananiah announced that God would break the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar in the same way. It was a powerful public performance. The crowd could see the broken wood. The message was simple. Jeremiah is wrong. Babylon will be broken. and Jeremiah walked away. That detail is significant. He did not engage in a theatrical contest. He left. For a moment, Hananiah appeared to have won. The physical symbol was destroyed. The optimistic message stood unchallenged. But then the word came again to Jeremiah. He returned with a harder message. Hananiah had broken wooden bars. They would be replaced with iron. The attempt to deny Babylonian domination would make the burden heavier, not lighter. Jeremiah also announced judgment on Hananiah personally. The prophet had made the people trust in a lie. That same year, Hananiah died. The confrontation exposed a theme that would dominate the final years of Judah. False hope can be more dangerous than fear. Fear may cause people to seek help. False hope can convince them that no help is necessary. Jeremiah was fighting a message that told Judah there was no need to change course. And every time that message sounded attractive, Babylon grew stronger. Zedekiah now ruled in Jerusalem. The biblical portrait of him is complicated. He was not Jehoiakim. He did not respond to Jeremiah with the same open contempt. At times, Zedekiah sought Jeremiah privately. He wanted to know whether there was a word from the Lord. He feared what Jeremiah said, but he also feared his officials. He feared political consequences. He feared public opinion. He feared Babylon. Zedekiah's tragedy would not be that he never heard the truth. His tragedy would be that hearing truth did not produce courage. That crisis was still developing. For now, Judah remained under Babylonian control, and Jeremiah continued to use symbols that forced people to confront the reality they wanted to avoid. He warned that nations which refused Babylon's yoke would suffer. He sent messages to exiles. He confronted prophets. He denounced rulers. But his ministry was also becoming more personal, because resistance was no longer coming only from kings and religious officials. It was coming from his own hometown, Anathoth, the place of his family, the place where his story had begun. Jeremiah learned that men from Anathoth were plotting against him. They wanted him to stop prophesying. The warning was severe. Do not prophesy in the name of the Lord, or you may die by our hands. This betrayal affected Jeremiah deeply. Opposition from a king was one thing. Opposition from your own community was another. Jeremiah described himself as a gentle lamb led to slaughter. He had not known what they were planning. Now he discovered that people close to his own roots wanted him silenced. Prophetic ministry had made him a stranger, not only in Jerusalem, but also at home. He brought his anguish before God, and the response he received was not simple comfort. It was preparation for harder days. If running with men had exhausted Jeremiah, how would he compete with horses? If he stumbled in a safe land, what would happen in the thickets of the Jordan? The message was sobering. What Jeremiah had already suffered was not the worst. Greater pressure was coming. That is often forgotten when his early ministry is summarized. Jeremiah did not move from calling directly to Jerusalem's destruction. There were years of waiting, years of repetition, years when he had to preach warnings whose complete fulfillment had not yet arrived. Years in which enemies could point to the standing city and ask, "Where is this destruction you keep talking about?" That delay made his calling harder. A prophet announcing an immediate event may quickly be vindicated or disproven. Jeremiah had to endure an extended period in which history was moving toward fulfillment slowly enough for people to mock him. And Jeremiah himself sometimes struggled with that delay. His laments reveal a man wrestling with the apparent success of the wicked. Why do those who act treacherously prosper? Why do people speak God's name while their hearts remain far away? Jeremiah was not a machine delivering messages. He experienced the tension of watching injustice continue while judgment seemed delayed. Yet delay was not absence. Babylon remained, the exile remained, and the political temptation to resist Babylon intensified. Meanwhile, Jeremiah continued attacking the deeper corruption of Judah. He spoke against shepherds, leaders who destroyed and scattered the flock. In prophetic language, kings and rulers were supposed to care for the people like shepherds. But Judah's leadership had failed. Jeremiah accused them of neglecting responsibility. Yet even within that criticism appeared another promise. God would gather the remnant. He would raise up better shepherds. And Jeremiah spoke of a future righteous branch from the line of David, a king who would reign wisely, a king associated with justice and righteousness. This is one of the places where Jeremiah's message begins to open beyond the immediate political collapse. The Davidic monarchy in Jeremiah's own lifetime was failing. Jehoiakim had resisted. Jehoiachin had been exiled. Zedekiah would fail as well. Yet Jeremiah's prophecy did not conclude that the Davidic promise had become meaningless. Instead, failure intensified expectation. If the present kings could not fulfill the calling of righteous rule, then hope looked forward. This pattern appears repeatedly in Jeremiah. The present is judged. The future is not abandoned. The kingdom is collapsing. The promise remains. This is why reducing Jeremiah to a prophet of doom misses half the story. He announced doom because he refused to lie about the present. He announced hope because he refused to believe the present was the final word. But hope had an order. First truth, then restoration. First exile, then return. First the tearing down, then the building. First uprooting, then planting. The people of Judah wanted to reverse that order. They wanted planting without uprooting, healing without diagnosis, peace without repentance, return without exile. Jeremiah would not give it to them. His refusal made him hated, but it also preserved the integrity of hope. Because hope based on a lie cannot survive reality. Jeremiah's hope could. Years passed. The exiles settled in Babylon. Jehoiakim remained in captivity. Zedekiah continued on the throne. Jerusalem adjusted to its reduced condition. And this adjustment created a dangerous illusion. Perhaps the worst had already happened. Yes, some people had been deported. Yes, treasures had been taken. Yes, Babylon controlled Judah. But Jerusalem still stood. The temple still stood. The city had survived one Babylonian intervention. Maybe it would survive another. Maybe Jeremiah had exaggerated the danger. Maybe resistance could succeed after all. Political pressure built around Zedekiah. Nationalist voices grew stronger. Egypt again appeared as a possible source of help. The possibility of rebellion returned. Jeremiah saw where it would lead, and at this stage another symbolic vision sharpened the difference between those already in exile and those still in Jerusalem. Jeremiah saw two baskets of figs placed before the temple. One contained very good figs. The other contained figs so bad they could not be eaten. The interpretation was surprising. The good figs represented the exiles already taken to Babylon. That must have shocked people still living safely in Judah. Common logic would have said the opposite. Those deported had lost. Those remaining in Jerusalem had been spared. Surely the people still in the land were the blessed ones. Jeremiah overturned that assumption. The exiles, though suffering, were the group through whom future restoration would come. God would watch over them. He would bring them back. He would give them a heart to know him. The bad figs represented Zedekiah, his officials, and those who persisted in rebellion. In other words, physical location did not reveal spiritual security. Being outside Jerusalem did not mean being outside God's future. Being inside Jerusalem did not guarantee protection. Again, Jeremiah attacked false confidence. The exile might feel like abandonment, but it could become the place of preservation. Remaining in the city might feel like safety, but it could become the place of catastrophe. This reversal prepared the way for one of Jeremiah's most important theological developments. Judah was losing everything it had treated as permanent: land, political independence, king, temple, national security. If covenant faithfulness had failed at every outward level, what kind of restoration could possibly be enough? Would simply returning people to the land solve the problem? Would rebuilding walls solve it? Would restoring a king solve it? Would reconstructing the temple solve it? Jeremiah's answer would eventually reach deeper. The problem was the heart, and therefore the future covenant would have to reach the heart. Before Jeremiah could fully unfold that promise, Judah would again choose rebellion. Zedekiah would break with Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar would return. Jerusalem would be surrounded. The city that trusted its walls would watch those walls become a prison. But even before the siege closed around Jerusalem, Jeremiah had already made the central conflict clear. The choice was no longer between optimism and pessimism. It was between truth and denial. Hananiah had broken the wooden yoke, but Babylon remained. Jehoiakim had burned the scroll, but the words remained. Jehoiakim had lost the throne, but the people still resisted the lesson. And Zedekiah now sat in Jerusalem facing the same question every generation before him had tried to avoid. Would Judah finally listen before the warning became history? The crisis deepens, and the point of no return. Jerusalem had survived once. That was the danger. The city had already experienced Babylonian pressure. A king had been removed, treasures had been taken, exiles had been carried away. Yet the walls still stood, the temple still functioned, and Zedekiah still sat on the throne. For many in Judah, survival became evidence that total destruction could still be avoided. Perhaps Babylon had taken enough. Perhaps the first deportation was the worst of it. Perhaps political patience, military preparation, or an alliance with Egypt could reverse the humiliation. Jeremiah saw something different. He saw a kingdom standing at the edge of a deeper collapse. The first exile had not ended the crisis. It had exposed it. And the question was no longer whether Judah had suffered. The question was whether Judah had learned. Zedekiah was now trapped between forces stronger than he was. Babylon had placed him on the throne. That meant his kingship existed under Babylonian authority. But inside Judah, pressure grew from those who wanted independence. Egypt still appeared capable of challenging Babylon. National pride made submission unbearable. And Jeremiah's message that Judah should accept Babylonian rule rather than rebel sounded increasingly intolerable. The king's dilemma was political. Jeremiah's diagnosis was spiritual. Zedekiah wanted to know how to preserve his throne. Jeremiah kept asking whether the king would obey the word he had been given. This conflict would define the final years of Judah. Zedekiah was not completely indifferent to Jeremiah. That makes his story more tragic. He listened. He asked questions. He sought private conversations. He wanted prophetic guidance. But hearing truth and acting on truth are not the same thing. Zedekiah's greatest weakness was not ignorance. It was indecision. Again and again he would stand between conviction and fear would win. The situation deteriorated. Babylon's power remained dominant, but anti-Babylonian expectations refused to die. There were still political voices encouraging resistance. There were still prophets promising deliverance. There was still hope in Egypt. And there was still a deep unwillingness to accept that submission to Babylon might actually be the path through judgment rather than betrayal of Judah. For Jeremiah, this was one of the cruelest parts of his calling. He was telling his own nation not to fight the empire that threatened it. To people who loved Judah, that sounded impossible. To military leaders, it sounded dangerous. To nationalists, it sounded treasonous. But Jeremiah was operating from a different premise. Babylon's rise was not outside the sovereignty of God. Therefore, Judah's refusal to accept the consequences of its own covenant rebellion would not create freedom. It would create greater destruction. The difference is important. Jeremiah was not telling Judah that Babylon was morally good. He was not declaring Nebuchadnezzar righteous. He was saying that Judah could not escape judgment merely by choosing a different military strategy. This is one of the hardest lessons in the book. Sometimes a people can become so focused on defeating the enemy outside that they refuse to confront the corruption inside. Jeremiah would not let Judah do that. He repeatedly returned to the deeper causes: idolatry, injustice, violence, false worship, broken covenant, trust in appearances, trust in alliances, trust in institutions while rejecting the God those institutions were supposed to honor. The kingdom's military problem was real, but its spiritual problem was older. The armies coming against Jerusalem were the visible crisis. The invisible crisis had been growing for generations. And as political tension increased, Jeremiah became more isolated. His warnings sounded darker precisely when others wanted encouragement. He said the siege would come. He said the king of Babylon would prevail. He said those who resisted would suffer. And he said there was still a path to life. That last point is easy to miss. Jeremiah's message was severe, but it was not nihilistic. Even now, after years of rebellion, he still spoke of choices. Submit, turn, listen, live. The tragedy is that those choices became narrower as time passed. Early in Jeremiah's ministry, the call had been broad: return to covenant faithfulness, change your ways, put away injustice, abandon false worship. Years later, after warning had been rejected, the immediate political choice had become painfully specific: do not rebel against Babylon. The longer Judah refused correction, the more limited the remaining options became. This is one of the great movements of Jeremiah's story. Consequences harden over time. A warning ignored today can become a crisis tomorrow. A crisis ignored tomorrow can become a catastrophe later. By the reign of Zedekiah, Judah was reaching that final stage. And yet there were moments when it seemed the nation might still change direction. At one point, the people made a covenant concerning Hebrew slaves. According to the law, fellow Hebrews were not to be held indefinitely in permanent servitude under ordinary conditions. During the crisis, the people released enslaved Hebrew men and women. For a moment, it looked like obedience. Then they reversed the decision. They took back those they had freed and forced them again into slavery. Jeremiah condemned the action. The episode revealed the problem in miniature. Under pressure, the people could perform an act of reform. But when circumstances shifted, they returned to the old pattern. This was Judah's national story compressed into one event. Crisis produced temporary obedience. Relief produced relapse. The heart had not changed. And Jeremiah warned that because they had refused liberty to others, judgment would now bring a different kind of liberty. Liberty to sword, pestilence, and famine. The language was bitterly ironic. They had refused to release those under their control. Now, forces beyond their control would be released upon them. The political situation continued to move toward war. Zedekiah rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar responded. Babylonian armies marched against Jerusalem. The long mourning became a siege. This was the moment when Jeremiah's prophecies stopped sounding theoretical. Enemy camps appeared, routes were cut, movement became dangerous. The city that had once seemed protected by walls now depended on those walls for survival. Jerusalem became enclosed. A siege in the ancient world was not simply a military event. It was a slow destruction of normal life. Food supplies diminished, prices rose, fear spread. Disease became a threat, rumors multiplied. Every day the walls held was another day of uncertainty. Every movement outside the city raised questions. Would Egypt intervene? Would Babylon withdraw? Could the siege be broken? Would some miraculous deliverance occur as Jerusalem had experienced in earlier generations? That memory mattered. Centuries earlier, during the reign of Hezekiah, Jerusalem had survived an Assyrian threat that seemed overwhelming. People knew that story. The city had escaped before. Why not again? Jeremiah's answer was painful, because this was not that moment. Faith does not mean assuming that God must repeat yesterday's deliverance in the same way today. Jerusalem's history could inspire trust. It could also become a source of presumption. That was the danger. The people wanted the outcome of Hezekiah's generation without the humility that had marked Hezekiah's response. They wanted deliverance as entitlement. Jeremiah refused to promise it. And then, unexpectedly, the Babylonian army withdrew. Egypt had moved, Pharaoh's forces were approaching, and Babylon temporarily lifted the siege to respond. Imagine what that moment must have felt like inside Jerusalem. The pressure eased. Enemy forces moved away. The city could breathe. Those who had dismissed Jeremiah now had evidence. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps Egypt really would save them. Perhaps Babylon was not invincible. Perhaps all those predictions of destruction had been exaggerated. This was exactly the kind of moment that could destroy Jeremiah's credibility in the eyes of the public. But Jeremiah did not change the message. He warned Zedekiah not to deceive himself. The Babylonian army would return. Egypt would not provide permanent rescue. Jerusalem would still be burned. The temporary withdrawal was not salvation. It was interruption. This distinction could not have been more important. A pause in consequences is not always the cancellation of consequences. But people often interpret delay as vindication. Judah had done this before. Now it did it again. While the Babylonian forces were temporarily absent, Jeremiah attempted to leave Jerusalem and go into the territory of Benjamin. At the Benjamin gate, he was stopped by an official named Irijah. The accusation came immediately. Jeremiah was deserting to the Babylonians. He denied it. The charge was false. But by now, Jeremiah's public reputation had become so closely associated with surrender that suspicion was easy. He had spent years telling the people that those who went out to the Babylonians could survive. Now, when he tried to leave the city for personal business, officials assumed he was defecting. Irijah did not believe him. Jeremiah was arrested. He was beaten. Then he was imprisoned in the house of Jonathan the secretary, which had been turned into a prison. The prophet who had warned Judah that the city was becoming a trap was now trapped inside it. Days passed. Jeremiah remained confined. The conditions appear to have been harsh enough that he later pleaded not to be returned there. Then Zedekiah summoned him secretly. The king wanted to know, is there any word from the Lord even now, even after rebellion? Even after the siege, even after Jeremiah had been accused and imprisoned, Zedekiah still wanted a word. Jeremiah answered, yes, there was a word. The king would be delivered into the hand of Babylon. The message had not changed. Jeremiah then confronted Zedekiah. What crime had he committed against the king, the officials, or the people that justified imprisonment? And where were the prophets who had told the king that Babylon would not come against Jerusalem? That question struck at the heart of everything. The optimistic voices had promised safety. Babylon had come. Jeremiah had warned of invasion. He was now sitting in prison because people did not like the warning that history itself was confirming. Zedekiah softened Jeremiah's treatment. He ordered that Jeremiah be placed in the courtyard of the guard rather than returned to the harsher prison. He was given bread while supplies lasted. This was not freedom, but it kept him alive. And from the courtyard, Jeremiah continued to speak. The siege resumed. Babylon returned. The walls closed in again. This time, the illusion of Egyptian rescue began to collapse. Jeremiah's message became even more direct. Those who remained in the city would face sword, famine, and disease. Those who surrendered to the Babylonians would live. To Jeremiah, this was a message of survival. To Judah's officials, it was intolerable. They accused him of weakening the hands of the soldiers and the people. From a military perspective, the accusation made sense. If a prophet tells defenders that resistance is doomed and surrender leads to life, morale will fall. The officials concluded that Jeremiah was not seeking the welfare of the people. He was harming them. They went to Zedekiah. This man should be put to death. The king's response revealed his weakness. He did not defend Jeremiah. He did not firmly reject the officials. He told them Jeremiah was in their hands. The king admitted, in effect, that he could do nothing against them. This is one of the most revealing moments in Zedekiah's reign. He wore the crown, but he lacked authority when courage was required. Jeremiah had no army, no palace, no political faction capable of protecting him. His only power was the message. The officials took him. They lowered him by ropes into a cistern belonging to Malchiah, a member of the royal family. There was no water in it, only mud. Jeremiah sank into the mud. No executioner raised a sword. No public sentence was required. They could simply leave him there. He would weaken, starve, perhaps suffocate or die from exposure. The prophet who had spent years warning that Judah was sinking into destruction was now physically sinking into the earth. It is one of the darkest images in his story. Jerusalem was under siege. Food was disappearing. Political leaders were panicking. The king was afraid, and the prophet who had told them how to survive was abandoned in a pit. But someone noticed. His name was Ebed-Melech. He was a Cushite official in the royal household. In a story filled with kings, priests, prophets, military leaders, and officials, one foreign court servant became the person willing to act. Ebed-Melech approached Zedekiah. He told the king that the officials had acted wickedly. Jeremiah would die in the cistern, especially because there was almost no bread left in the city. Zedekiah finally ordered a rescue. Ebed-Melech did not simply throw down ropes. He gathered worn cloths and old rags and lowered them to Jeremiah so they could be placed under his arms. Even in the middle of catastrophe, the detail is strikingly human. The prophet was weak. The ropes could injure him. So Ebed-Melech provided padding. Then they pulled Jeremiah up from the mud. He returned to the courtyard of the guard. Later, Jeremiah would deliver a promise to Ebed-Melech. When Jerusalem fell, the man who had trusted enough to rescue the prophet would himself be spared. The city's powerful men had tried to kill Jeremiah. A foreign servant saved him. Again, Jeremiah's world overturned assumptions. Position did not guarantee faithfulness. Nationality did not determine courage. The king hesitated. The officials acted wickedly. The outsider did what was right. But Jeremiah's rescue did not end the crisis. Zedekiah summoned him again. This time the meeting was secret. The king wanted an answer. He made Jeremiah promise not to hide anything. Jeremiah hesitated. If he told the truth, would the king kill him? And even if he gave advice, would the king listen? Zedekiah swore that he would not put Jeremiah to death or hand him over to those who wanted him killed. So Jeremiah spoke plainly. If Zedekiah surrendered to the officials of the king of Babylon, he would live. The city would not be burned. His household would survive. But if he refused, Jerusalem would be handed over. The city would burn. The king would not escape. This was the clearest personal choice Zedekiah would receive. Not an abstract sermon, not a symbolic vision, not a general warning to the nation. A direct decision: surrender and live, refuse and lose the city. Zedekiah revealed what truly controlled him. He was afraid, not only of Babylon. He feared the Judeans who had already defected to Babylon. He worried that if he surrendered, he might be handed over to them and abused. Jeremiah assured him that this would not happen. Obey and it will go well with you. But if you refuse, Jeremiah warned, the consequences will be terrible. The women of the palace would be taken away. The city would burn. Zedekiah listened. Then he told Jeremiah to keep the conversation secret. If officials asked what had been discussed, Jeremiah was to describe only his plea not to be returned to the prison. The officials did question him. Jeremiah answered as instructed. The private warning remained between prophet and king, and Zedekiah did not surrender. This is where his story becomes almost unbearable. He knew, he asked, he heard, he was given a path, but fear of humiliation became stronger than fear of destruction. The king was trying to preserve dignity, while the kingdom itself was dying. He feared what a group of men might do to him. He failed to reckon with what an empire would do to his city. Jeremiah could give him truth. He could not give him courage. Outside the palace, the siege tightened. Food became scarce. The Book of Kings describes famine becoming severe. The city that once celebrated feasts now struggled to eat. The city that had trusted its walls discovered the cost of being enclosed by them. Walls protect against enemies. In a siege, they can also trap hunger inside. Every loaf mattered. Every storage jar mattered. Every day reduced what remained. Jeremiah stayed in the courtyard of the guard. He could hear the city dying around him. This was the nation he had pleaded with for decades. These were not anonymous enemies. These were his people. Children, families, priests, soldiers, neighbors. Jeremiah's vindication would not feel like victory. If Jerusalem fell, he would be proven right. But being right would mean watching everything he loved collapse. That is the tragedy of the weeping prophet. He did not want fulfillment if fulfillment meant destruction. He wanted repentance that would make the warning unnecessary. But Judah had moved beyond easy reversal. The city now stood at the point of no return. Yet even here, when nearly everything was collapsing, Jeremiah did something extraordinary. He spoke of restoration, not vaguely, not as a sentimental refusal to accept reality. He performed an action that seemed irrational precisely because he believed the judgment was real. While Jeremiah was confined and Babylonian forces surrounded Jerusalem, a relative came to him with a legal matter. A field in Anathoth was available for purchase. Under Israelite property customs, a close relative could have the right or responsibility to redeem family land. But think about the timing. Anathoth lay in territory already exposed to Babylonian occupation. The kingdom was collapsing. Jeremiah himself was confined. Jerusalem was under siege. Land values in practical terms could hardly have looked less secure. And Jeremiah bought the field. He weighed out the silver. A deed was signed. Witnesses were present. The transaction was documented. The sealed and open copies of the deed were preserved. Then Jeremiah instructed Baruch to place the documents in an earthenware jar so they could last for a long time. Why buy land in a country being conquered? Because Jeremiah believed destruction was not the end. The deed became a prophecy. Houses, fields, and vineyards would again be bought in the land. Jeremiah was not denying Babylon's victory. He was investing beyond it. That is what made the act powerful. False prophets had offered hope by saying judgment would not happen. Jeremiah offered hope after insisting judgment would happen. The difference was enormous. False hope said, "You will lose nothing." Jeremiah's hope said, "You may lose almost everything." But the story is still not over. He prayed after buying the field. His prayer revealed the tension inside him. God had created heaven and earth. Nothing was too hard for him. God had brought Israel out of Egypt. He had given the land, yet the people had disobeyed. Now siege ramps had reached Jerusalem. Sword, famine, and disease threatened the city. Babylon stood exactly where Jeremiah had said it would. Jeremiah understood the judgment, but the command to buy land still left him staring into mystery. Why purchase property if conquest was certain? The answer came with one of the great declarations of hope in the book. Jerusalem would indeed be handed over. The people would indeed be scattered because of their persistent rebellion, but God would gather them again. They would dwell securely. There would be restoration. Fields would again be purchased. Documents would again be signed. Silver would again change hands. Life would return to places that armies had devastated. This was not optimism about tomorrow morning. It was covenant hope beyond catastrophe. And Jeremiah's prophecy went even deeper. The problem that had destroyed Judah could not be solved merely by giving the people another chance under the same conditions. The history of Israel had shown something about the human heart. Law written before people could be resisted. Covenant words could be heard and ignored. Reforms could be performed outwardly while inner loyalties remained divided. So Jeremiah spoke of a new covenant. A day would come when the relationship between God and his people would be described in deeper terms. The law would not simply stand outside them as an instruction they repeatedly violated. It would be written within, written on the heart. The knowledge of God would no longer be presented merely as an external national identity. The covenant would involve inward transformation. Forgiveness stood at the center of the promise. God would forgive iniquity and remember sin no more. These words are among the most important in Jeremiah. They emerged not during national strength, but during national collapse. The new covenant was proclaimed while the old political structures were failing. The throne was unstable. The land was being conquered. The temple was threatened. The city was starving. And in the middle of that, Jeremiah announced that the relationship between God and his people still had a future. This is why judgment and hope cannot be separated in his ministry. If we remove judgment, the promise becomes shallow. If we remove hope, the judgment becomes despair.
Jeremiah held both together. The old structures were collapsing because the covenant had been persistently violated. Yet God's purpose would move forward through restoration, forgiveness, and inward renewal. For Christian readers, the New Testament later takes up the language of Jeremiah's new covenant explicitly. But within Jeremiah's own historical setting, the promise first spoke to a people facing exile and national ruin. The immediate meaning mattered.
Judah's collapse would not erase God's covenant purpose. Exile would not be final. The people would not be forgotten. The future would require more than rebuilding walls. It would require renewed hearts. But that future lay beyond the siege. Jerusalem still had to face what was already at its gates. Nebuchadnezzar's army had returned. Zedekiah had rejected his clearest opportunity to surrender. Food was disappearing. Officials remained hostile to Jeremiah. The prophet had purchased a field he could not safely visit. He held promises for a future that no one around him could yet see. And inside the city, time was running out. There are moments in history when collapse happens suddenly. Jerusalem's final crisis was not like that. It was slow enough for people to feel every stage. The narrowing choices, the false hopes, the temporary relief, the return of the enemy, the hunger, the fear, the secret meetings, the failed courage, the imprisoned prophet, the unopened path to survival. By now, the question was no longer whether Jeremiah had been too severe. The question was whether anything could still prevent the final breach. The king had heard the warning. The city had seen the army. The people had experienced famine. The false promises had failed, and still Jerusalem would not surrender. Beyond the walls, Babylon waited. Inside them, Judah waited too. One side waited for the city to weaken, the other waited for a miracle. Jeremiah waited for the word he had spoken for decades to become history. And when the walls finally broke, there would be no reform left to attempt, no alliance left to trust, no scroll left to burn, no prophet left to blame, only consequences. The new covenant in the shadow of disaster. Jerusalem was being crushed from the outside, yet one of Jeremiah's greatest messages of hope emerged from inside a prison courtyard. That contrast is essential. The prophet did not speak about restoration because circumstances were improving. They were getting worse. The Babylonian army had returned. The siege tightened. Food was disappearing. Zedekiah had already heard the path that might preserve his life in the city, but fear kept him from acting. Jeremiah remained confined. And still in the middle of a collapsing kingdom, the word he carried began to look beyond the ruins. This is where the story of Jeremiah becomes larger than the fall of Jerusalem. For years he had warned Judah that rebellion would bring judgment. Now he began to make something equally clear. Judgment would not be the end of the covenant story. The nation could lose its city. It could lose its king. It could lose political independence. It could even lose the temple around which so much of its identity had been built. But the promise would continue. That hope was not based on Judah's strength. Judah had almost none left. It was based on the character and purpose of God. Jeremiah had spent much of his ministry tearing down illusions. The illusion that the temple made Jerusalem untouchable. The illusion that Egypt could guarantee rescue. The illusion that false prophets could announce peace into existence. The illusion that national identity could replace covenant faithfulness. The illusion that outward reform was enough when the heart remained divided. Now that those illusions were collapsing, Jeremiah could speak about a hope that did not depend on them. This is why his restoration prophecies carry such weight. They do not come from denial. They come after denial has been exposed. Jeremiah had no reason to tell the people that everything was fine. He had spent years insisting that everything was not fine. His hope, therefore, begins at a deeper level. The city may fall. The people may be scattered. But the story is not finished. Jeremiah described a future in which God would gather those who had been dispersed. The people would return. Joy would replace mourning. Fields would again be cultivated. Worship would be restored. Communities would again live in the land. But the promise went beyond geography. Return to the land alone would not solve the deeper problem. Judah had possessed the land before. It had still rebelled. The people had possessed the law before. They had still broken covenant. They had possessed the temple before. They had still trusted the building while rejecting the God worshipped there. They had possessed kings from the house of David. Those kings had still failed. If restoration meant only recreating the same external structures, the same disaster could happen again. Jeremiah's message therefore moved inward. The problem was the heart, and the future had to reach the heart. He spoke of a coming day when God would make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not because the earlier covenant had been meaningless. The earlier covenant had revealed God's will, established Israel's identity, and ordered the life of the people. The failure was not in the covenant's holiness. The failure was in the people's persistent refusal to keep it. Jeremiah's language was clear. The people had broken covenant. So the promised future would involve something deeper than another external command. The law would be placed within them, written on their hearts. The relationship would be described personally. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Knowledge of God would not remain merely a public identity inherited from the nation. The promise reached toward inward knowledge, and at the center stood forgiveness. Iniquity forgiven, sin no longer held against them in the same way. For a prophet whose ministry had spent decades naming Judah's guilt, this was extraordinary. Jeremiah was not minimizing sin. He was announcing a future in which sin would not have the final word. Judgment revealed the seriousness of rebellion. Forgiveness revealed that judgment was not God's ultimate purpose for his people. This is the theological center of Jeremiah's hope. The city could be burned, but covenant purpose could not be burned with it. A scroll could be cut apart, but the word could be written again. A king could lose the throne, but the promise associated with righteous kingship could survive the dynasty's immediate collapse. A people could be taken from the land, but exile could not erase their future. Jeremiah had already seen this pattern in the vision of the figs. Those carried away to Babylon appeared defeated, yet they were the group connected with future restoration. Those who remained in Jerusalem appeared secure, yet their false security placed them in greater danger. The exile, therefore, would become more than punishment. It would become a place through which a remnant survived. This did not make exile pleasant. Jeremiah never romanticized it. Families were separated. Homes were lost. Political structures were destroyed. The humiliation was real. But exile did not mean abandonment. The people taken to Babylon were told to build houses, plant gardens, raise families, and seek the welfare of the cities where they lived. Why? Because life continued even under judgment, and because judgment itself existed inside a larger story. Jeremiah's hope had patience. That made it different from the promises of false prophets. They wanted restoration immediately. Jeremiah spoke of restoration beyond a long period of exile. They offered escape from consequences. Jeremiah offered a future through consequences. They said Babylon would soon disappear. Jeremiah said Babylon would remain long enough that the exiles should settle down. And yet, Jeremiah's message ultimately gave the stronger hope. Because only a hope that survives reality is worth trusting. The optimism of false prophets collapsed when Babylon returned. Jeremiah's promise was designed to survive the return of Babylon. It would even survive the fall of Jerusalem. That is why, in the darkest chapters of his life, Jeremiah performed the strange act of purchasing land. The timing made no economic sense. Babylonian armies were occupying the territory. Jeremiah was confined. The land itself was under threat. No sensible investor would look at Anathoth during a Babylonian invasion and conclude that the moment was ideal for buying property. But the transaction was not merely financial. It was prophetic. A relative approached Jeremiah regarding a field. Jeremiah recognized the event as connected with the word he had received. The purchase was made legally. Silver was weighed. The deed was written. It was sealed. Witnesses were present. An open copy was preserved. The documents were entrusted to Baruch. Then Jeremiah gave an unusual instruction. Place the deeds in an earthenware jar. Preserve them for many days. The papers mattered because the future mattered. Jeremiah was buying land under occupation because he believed that occupation was not permanent. The field might be inaccessible today. It might be worthless under present conditions. But a day would come when normal life returned. Fields would be bought again. Houses would be owned again. Vineyards would be planted again. Legal transactions would happen again. The prophet who had announced the end of the old order was placing silver into the future. There is something profoundly human about that sign. Restoration was not described only in abstract theological language. It looked like ordinary life returning. A family purchasing land, a farmer planting a vineyard, a house inhabited, a deed signed, a community stable enough to think beyond survival. After years of armies, famine, exile, and political collapse, these ordinary images became extraordinary. The return of normal life itself would become evidence of mercy. Jeremiah's prayer after purchasing the field showed that even he wrestled with the tension. He knew God's power. He remembered the Exodus. He remembered the gift of the land. He understood why judgment had come. Yet he also looked around at the siege and saw the apparent absurdity. The city was about to be delivered into Babylonian hands. Why buy land now? The answer was not that Jeremiah had misunderstood the danger. The danger was real. Jerusalem would fall. But after destruction would come restoration. The sequence mattered. Judah wanted restoration without destruction. Jeremiah declared restoration after destruction. That made all the difference. The same pattern appears in another major section of his prophecies. Jeremiah envisioned Rachel weeping for her children. The ancient matriarch becomes a poetic image of grief over loss and exile. The sound is mourning, children gone, families scattered, a nation wounded. But the lament is answered with hope. There is a future. The children will return. The road of exile will not become the final road. Jeremiah tells the people in effect to mark the way, remember the path. The journey away will one day become a journey home. This is the emotional landscape of Jeremiah's restoration message. He does not jump over grief. He moves through it. Tears are not denied, they are answered. This is another reason the title Weeping Prophet captures only part of him. Jeremiah understood grief deeply enough to speak credible hope. A person who has never taken loss seriously can offer cheap comfort. Jeremiah could not. He had spent years naming the disaster before others would admit it. When he spoke of restoration, he knew exactly what had to be restored. He also spoke about shepherds. Judah's leaders had failed. Kings had scattered rather than protected. Priests and prophets had misled. Officials had chosen political survival over truth. Jeremiah condemned those shepherds. But then he looked toward a future ruler, a righteous branch from David's line. A king who would reign wisely. A king associated with justice and righteousness. This promise carried enormous significance because the current Davidic monarchy was collapsing before Jeremiah's eyes. Jehoiakim had failed. Jehoiachin had been taken into exile. Zedekiah sat on a throne dependent on Babylon and lacked the courage to obey the warnings he sought. If Jeremiah had judged God's promise only by the kings immediately in front of him, the future would have looked empty. Instead, he spoke beyond them. The failure of present kings did not erase the hope of righteous kingship. It made the need clearer. Jeremiah's message, therefore, held several layers of restoration together. Return to the land, renewed community, faithful leadership, forgiveness, inward covenant transformation, reunification of a people fractured by generations of division. The house of Israel and the house of Judah were both included in his horizon. Remember what that meant. The northern kingdom had fallen long before Jeremiah's ministry. Its political structure was gone. Its people had experienced displacement. Judah had spent generations continuing after Israel's collapse. Now Jeremiah spoke of a future larger than the survival of Judah alone. Restoration would reach beyond the boundaries created by past catastrophe. The story was not merely about rescuing Jerusalem. It was about the renewal of God's people. But outside Jeremiah's visions, the immediate world remained brutal. The Babylonians were not retreating. The siege was not easing. The king was not surrendering. The officials were not suddenly becoming receptive. The bread supply was shrinking. Jeremiah was still confined. Hope had not changed the present facts. This is another important feature of biblical hope. It does not always remove the immediate crisis. Sometimes it gives meaning beyond it. Jeremiah still had to live through the siege. He still had to watch Zedekiah hesitate. He still had to endure hostility. The promise of a new covenant did not open the gates and send Babylon home. It told Jeremiah that Babylon would not own the final chapter. And perhaps nowhere was the difference between Jeremiah and the false prophets clearer than here. False prophets used hope to deny the crisis. Jeremiah used hope to survive the crisis. One kind of hope needed the city not to fall. The other kind could stand even after the city fell. That was the hope Judah actually needed. Jeremiah also made clear that Babylon itself would not rule forever. The empire was an instrument in judgment, but it was not exempt from judgment. This distinction prevented a dangerous misunderstanding. If Babylon conquered Judah within God's sovereign purpose, that did not mean Babylon possessed unlimited moral approval. Empires could serve a role in history and still be accountable for violence, arrogance, and oppression. Jeremiah announced oracles against nations, including Babylon. The conqueror would itself one day face consequences. The empire that carried Judah into exile was not the final kingdom. The same Babylon that appeared unstoppable would eventually fall. For Judah, that meant submission to present judgment did not require worshiping the power enforcing it. Babylon could be resisted spiritually, even when Judah was commanded to accept its political domination for a time. The people were still to remain faithful to God. Exile would test whether their identity depended on Jerusalem alone. Could they pray in a foreign land? Could they raise families under foreign rule? Could they seek the welfare of a pagan city without becoming absorbed into its gods? Could covenant identity survive away from the temple? Those questions would become crucial for the generations shaped by exile. Jeremiah helped prepare them for that future before many in Jerusalem were willing to admit that future was coming. This is why his letter to the exiles and his new covenant prophecy belong together. One taught them how to live through displacement. The other told them displacement would not define them forever. One said, "Build houses in Babylon." The other said, "You will not belong to Babylon forever." One said, "Accept the long road." The other said, "The road still leads somewhere." Jeremiah's ministry had now become a bridge between two worlds. Behind him stood the Judah of Josiah, a functioning kingdom, a reforming king, a temple filled with activity, a nation still imagining that political survival was normal. Ahead of him stood exile, a burned city, a destroyed sanctuary, a shattered monarchy, a displaced population learning how to live under empire. Jeremiah stood between those worlds and carried both the funeral announcement for one age and the promise that another future remained possible. Yet the old age had not finished dying. The siege worsened. Babylonian siege works pressed closer to Jerusalem. The defenders grew weaker. Hunger increased. Political fear hardened. At some point, there is no longer enough food for optimism. A starving city cannot eat promises from false prophets. The population would begin to feel the difference between rhetoric and reality. Jeremiah had been accused of weakening morale, but the walls themselves were beginning to tell the same story he had told for years. Judah's leaders had made a series of choices. They had ignored warnings, trusted deceptive voices, broken commitments, rebelled politically, looked to Egypt, imprisoned the prophet, rejected surrender. Now those choices converged. That convergence is what makes historical catastrophe so difficult to understand if we focus only on the final day. Jerusalem did not fall because of one morning. It fell after a long chain of decisions. The breach in the wall would be sudden. The road toward that breach had been years long. Jeremiah's entire ministry had taken place on that road. He had watched Judah move from reform to resistance, from resistance to false confidence, from false confidence to rebellion, from rebellion to siege, from siege to desperation. And now the city was nearing the final stage. For Jeremiah personally, hope did not remove fear. He still knew what was coming. He had described death by sword, famine, and disease. He had seen the suffering that siege would produce. The promise of restoration did not make him indifferent to the people who would die before restoration arrived. This is why Jeremiah's grief matters. He was not looking at history from a distant future where everything had already been resolved. He was living inside the unresolved moment. That is where faith is hardest. It is easy to speak of restoration once rebuilding has begun. Jeremiah spoke of restoration while Babylonian soldiers were preparing to destroy. It is easy to believe land will have value when markets are stable. Jeremiah bought a field during invasion. It is easy to speak of covenant when institutions are strong. Jeremiah spoke of a new covenant while the visible structures of the old national order were collapsing. It is easy to promise a righteous king when the monarchy is flourishing. Jeremiah spoke of righteous kingship while the final king of Judah was failing. Everything about the message required looking beyond the immediate horizon. That horizon was about to become darker. Zedekiah still held one final responsibility. He had heard the truth. Jeremiah had told him that surrender could preserve his life and prevent the burning of the city. But the king remained afraid. Fear of his officials, fear of defectors, fear of humiliation, fear of appearing weak. The throne had become a prison of expectations. The king who feared losing everything by surrender would soon lose everything by refusing. Jeremiah could not make the decision for him. The prophet had done what prophets could do: warn, explain, plead, promise, repeat. The rest belonged to the king, and beyond the walls, Babylon waited for weakness. Ancient siege warfare rewarded patience. An army did not always need to storm immediately if hunger could do the work. Every day made Jerusalem more vulnerable. Every ration consumed reduced future resistance. Every sick soldier weakened the defense. Every rumor increased panic. Inside the city, men would have watched the walls. Outside, Babylon watched time. The imbalance was terrible. Nebuchadnezzar could draw upon the resources of an empire. Jerusalem could consume only what remained inside. The countdown had begun long before anyone knew the exact day it would end. Jeremiah's field deed sat preserved, a document for a future beyond the siege. His new covenant promise existed in words, a promise for hearts beyond the rebellion. His restoration prophecies spoke of roads home, but no one was traveling home yet. The roads were carrying armies toward Jerusalem. The contrast could not have been sharper. Future vineyards, present famine. Future houses, present siege. Future forgiveness, present judgment. Future return, present exile. Jeremiah held all of it together. That was his burden, and that was his hope. Before the city fell, there would be one final test. Could the warnings that had been rejected for decades still produce obedience at the last possible moment? Could Zedekiah abandon pride? Could leaders accept surrender? Could Jerusalem recognize that survival might now look like defeat? Or would the city continue fighting until the decision was no longer theirs to make? The walls still stood, but Babylon was close. The king still ruled, but his authority was hollowing out. The temple still rose above Jerusalem, but Jeremiah had already warned that sacred stones could not shield a rebellious nation. The prophets still spoke, but time for response was almost gone. Soon there would be no more debate between Jeremiah and the false prophets. No more political calculation over Egypt, no more question about whether Babylon would return. The army was already there. The next question was simpler. When the walls finally opened, who would still be alive to see what remained? The final test before Jerusalem's fall. The siege did not end with a single battle. It tightened. Day after day, Babylon pressed against Jerusalem. The city that had once trusted its walls now lived behind them like a prisoner. Food became scarce. Fear spread through the streets. Officials argued over what to do. Soldiers watched the enemy outside. Families counted what remained in storage. And somewhere inside the city, Jeremiah continued to speak the same message Judah had resisted for years. Do not trust Egypt. Do not trust the walls. Do not trust the temple as though the building itself guarantees protection. Do not trust prophets who promise peace simply because peace is what everyone wants to hear. Submit to Babylon, and there is still a path to life. Resist, and the city will burn. By now, this was no longer abstract prophecy. Babylon was visible. The siege was real. Jerusalem could hear the machinery of war beyond its defenses. Yet even when evidence surrounded them, many leaders still treated Jeremiah as the problem. That is one of the darkest patterns in the final years of Judah. When a warning becomes unbearable, people sometimes attack the messenger because they cannot control the reality. Jeremiah had already been beaten, imprisoned, threatened, accused of treason, thrown into a cistern, pulled from the mud only because Ebed-Melech had the courage to intervene. Still, he spoke. He did not change the message to protect himself, and he did not pretend that surrender would feel honorable. That was part of the difficulty. To surrender to Babylon meant humiliation. It meant admitting that Judah had lost. It meant walking out through the gates before the conqueror. For Zedekiah, it meant submitting to the same empire against which he had rebelled. For military leaders, it meant laying down resistance. For officials, it meant accepting the collapse of their political strategy. For the people, it could feel like betrayal of everything Jerusalem represented. Jeremiah understood how hard the message sounded, but difficulty did not make it false. The final test of Judah would not be whether the people could imagine a miraculous escape. It would be whether they could obey when obedience looked like defeat. Zedekiah was at the center of that test. He was the king, but he was also a man ruled by fear. He feared Babylon. He feared his officials. He feared those Judeans who had already defected. He feared what surrender would do to his reputation. And fear created paralysis. The king repeatedly sought Jeremiah's counsel in secret. That secrecy reveals the tension around him. Zedekiah wanted truth, but he did not want to be seen wanting it. He listened privately to the prophet his government publicly imprisoned. He asked for guidance, but he hesitated to follow it. This is not ignorance. It is divided loyalty. Zedekiah had enough information to know that Jeremiah's warnings were serious. He had already watched false predictions fail. He had watched Babylon return after Egypt's temporary intervention. He had seen the city surrounded again. He had heard Jeremiah tell him directly what would happen if he refused to surrender. Still, he delayed. The tragedy of indecision is that delay becomes a decision of its own. Every day Zedekiah waited, the city weakened. Every day the city weakened, the terms of survival narrowed. Every day resistance continued, Babylon moved closer to breaching the walls. There are moments when refusing to choose preserves options. This was not one of them. Zedekiah's refusal to act was destroying the options Jeremiah had told him remained. Meanwhile, Jerusalem descended deeper into crisis. The biblical accounts describe famine becoming severe. This is not a minor detail. Ancient siege warfare turned hunger into a weapon. An invading army could surround a city and allow time to do what immediate assault could not. Inside the walls, grain stores diminished. Water access became more difficult. Livestock disappeared. Normal commerce broke down. The wealthy might survive longer than the poor, but eventually, shortage touched everyone. The city's social order began to collapse under pressure. A siege does not merely attack walls. It attacks patience, trust, health, community, hope. The longer it lasts, the more desperate people become. Jeremiah had warned about sword famine and pestilence. Now the sequence was becoming lived experience. The sword waited outside. Famine grew inside. Disease followed hunger and overcrowding. What had once sounded like prophetic language was becoming daily reality. And still, there were those who believed continued resistance was the faithful path. Why? Because history can become a trap when remembered selectively. Jerusalem had survived Assyria under Hezekiah. The temple still stood. The city had stories of divine deliverance. But Jeremiah had repeatedly challenged the assumption that a past rescue created a permanent guarantee. Faith is not the same as presumption. The God who had delivered Jerusalem in one generation was not obligated to protect another generation while it rejected correction. That was Jeremiah's message, and it was precisely the message many people could not accept. They knew the story of deliverance. Jeremiah told them to understand the conditions of covenant faithfulness. They knew the sacred city. Jeremiah told them sacred geography was not immunity. They knew the temple. Jeremiah told them the temple could become a false object of trust if worshippers used it to avoid repentance. This conflict reached its final form during the siege. There were no longer years left for national reform, no long period for gradual political change. The immediate question had become survival. Jeremiah told the people that those who went out to the Babylonians would live. That message spread through the city. Officials hated it. From their perspective, Jeremiah was encouraging surrender in the middle of war. They argued that he was weakening soldiers and civilians. The accusation was understandable from a military perspective, but Jeremiah was not operating from the military premise that victory was still possible. He believed the outcome had already been determined. The only remaining choice was how much would be lost. This is one of the hardest forms of leadership truth. Sometimes the most courageous action is not to continue fighting. Sometimes survival requires recognizing when a battle has already been lost. But people often confuse persistence with faithfulness. Jeremiah separated them. He was not preaching cowardice, he was preaching obedience, and he paid for it. The Cistern episode had already shown just how far the officials were willing to go. They had taken him and lowered him into mud. They had intended for him to die there. His rescue by Ebed-Melech allowed him to continue speaking, but it did not change how many leaders viewed him. In fact, surviving made Jeremiah even more inconvenient. He was still alive, still talking, still saying Babylon would win, still telling the king to surrender, still insisting that Judah's patriotic slogans could not overturn divine judgment. He became a living contradiction to the political narrative inside Jerusalem. And Zedekiah continued to listen, privately. The king summoned Jeremiah again. The conversation was direct. Jeremiah gave him the path. If you go out to the king of Babylon's officers, you will live. Your family will live. This city will not be burned. But if you refuse, the city will be handed over and destroyed. There was no ambiguity. Zedekiah responded with fear. He was afraid of Judeans who had already gone over to the Babylonians. He feared humiliation. Perhaps they would mistreat him. Perhaps he would become a spectacle. Jeremiah told him not to fear. They will not hand you over. Obey. That word stood between the king and disaster. Not strategy, not alliance, not a new army. Obey. Zedekiah's response would reveal whether fear or truth had greater authority over him. And fear won. The king did not surrender. He sent Jeremiah back. The city continued to resist. The opportunity remained for a little longer, but not forever. Outside, Babylon kept pressure on Jerusalem. Inside, hunger increased, and Jeremiah entered one of the strangest positions a prophet could occupy. He knew the city would fall. He had said so for years. He had been persecuted for saying it. Now every day brought him closer to being proven right, but there was no satisfaction in it. Vindication could not feel like victory when vindication meant starvation, death, exile, and fire. That is one of the defining emotional truths of Jeremiah's life. He wanted Judah to listen before he was proven right. He did not want the ruins as evidence. He wanted repentance as evidence. But repentance did not come. This is why his grief belongs at the center of his story. He was not detached. The judgment he announced would fall on his own people. The city that would burn was his city. The temple that would be destroyed was the center of his nation's worship. The kingdom that would disappear was the kingdom shaped by the history of David. Even the leaders who rejected him were part of the people he had spent decades warning. Jeremiah's pain came from proximity. The nearer the catastrophe came, the less his message resembled a theological argument, and the more it became a funeral cry spoken before the funeral had begun. Yet hope remained. Not hope that the siege would suddenly disappear. That possibility was fading. The hope Jeremiah carried now looked beyond the immediate destruction. He had already bought the field. The deed had already been preserved. The new covenant promise had already been spoken. He had already announced that restoration would follow exile. This created a remarkable tension. Jeremiah was preparing Judah for two futures at the same time. The immediate future, Jerusalem will fall. The long future, Jerusalem's fall will not end the covenant story. The people needed both truths. Without the first, they would cling to denial. Without the second, they would fall into despair. Jeremiah refused both extremes. He did not say, "Everything will be fine." He also did not say, "Nothing remains." He said, in effect, "Everything you trust may be taken from you, but God's purpose is not finished." This is why the field at Anathoth mattered so much. Its value was not measured by what it was worth during the siege. Its value was in what it represented beyond the siege. The documents placed in the jar testified against despair. The soil might belong to Babylonian control now, but ordinary life would return. Fields would be purchased again. That hope did not make the suffering less real. It made the suffering less final. And the new covenant promise went deeper still. The future could not depend simply on another king commanding reform from above. Josiah had already shown the limits of that. The future required something that reached inward, a law written on the heart, a people who knew God, forgiveness that addressed the guilt Jeremiah had spent decades exposing. Jeremiah was describing restoration not as a return to the past, but as a movement towards something deeper than the past had achieved. That promise would eventually become central to later biblical reflection. But Jeremiah first spoke it to a generation watching everything visible collapse. That context cannot be removed. The new covenant was not announced in a peaceful classroom. It was born in the shadow of siege. It was hope spoken against smoke that had not yet risen, and now the smoke was close. The Babylonian army prepared for the final stage. The walls of Jerusalem had endured, but walls do not fight forever. Siege ramps, pressure, hunger, and military assault were wearing down the city. There would come a moment when the defense could no longer hold. A breach. That word carries enormous significance in the biblical account. For as long as the walls stood, Jerusalem still existed as a defended city. Once the wall was broken, everything changed. The barrier between the Babylonian army and the streets of Jerusalem disappeared. After that, wilderness would depend on escape or surrender. Zedekiah had not surrendered, so he prepared to flee. This is another painful irony. The king who had feared humiliation from surrender would soon attempt escape under far worse conditions. If he had walked out earlier, he had been told his life and city could be preserved. Now he would try to leave secretly after resistance had failed. Fear had not saved his dignity. It had removed his options. Jeremiah had warned him again and again, and now the consequence approached. Before the breach, however, it is worth understanding the scale of what was about to disappear. Judah was not merely losing a battle. The Davidic monarchy had existed in Jerusalem for generations. The temple had stood at the center of national worship. The city represented continuity with David and Solomon. The kingdom carried memories of reform, rebellion, intervention, deliverance, prophets, priests, and covenant. All of that was about to be struck at once. For the people living through it, the fall of Jerusalem would feel like the collapse of the world they understood. Could there still be a people of God without the land? Without the king? Without the temple? Without political independence? These questions would haunt the exile. Jeremiah had already begun answering them. Yes, the covenant story could continue. Yes, God could be present with exiles. Yes, restoration remained possible. Yes, the law could be written on hearts. But the people would have to learn these truths through loss. The old assumptions were about to be burned away. That is one of the great theological consequences of the exile. Judah had often treated physical institutions as guarantees. Exile forced a deeper question. What remains when the institutions disappear? Jeremiah's message answered, God's word remains, God's promise remains, accountability remains, hope remains. The kingdom can fall without God's purpose falling. But Jerusalem had not yet crossed that threshold. Inside the city, one last sequence unfolded. The Babylonian army breached the defenses. The exact moment would have been terrifying. For months, the walls had represented the final line. Then that line failed. Babylonian officials entered. The siege became occupation. Zedekiah and his soldiers fled by night. They moved through a gate near the king's garden and escaped toward the Arabah, the Jordan Valley region. The king was running. The man who had sat on David's throne was now a fugitive. He had heard Jeremiah's warning. He had been offered a path of surrender. He had rejected it. Now he tried to outrun the empire. Babylonian forces pursued him. They caught him in the plains near Jericho. His army scattered. Zedekiah was taken. The final king of Judah was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, and there the consequences became personal. The sons of Zedekiah were killed before his eyes. Judah's nobles were killed. Then Zedekiah was blinded. The last thing the king saw was the death of his sons. After that he was bound and taken to Babylon. It was a brutal fulfillment of Jeremiah's warning that Zedekiah would come into the hand of the king of Babylon. The man who had feared surrender had been captured. The king who had refused to go voluntarily was taken by force. The city he might have preserved would now face destruction. There is a terrible finality in the sequence. Zedekiah's decisions were over. No more secret meetings, no more questions for Jeremiah, no more hesitation, no more opportunity to choose. History had moved beyond decision into consequence. Jerusalem remained, but without its king. And Babylon was inside. The battle for the city was effectively finished. What remained was destruction. The temple, the palace, the houses, the walls, the structures Jeremiah had warned would not protect the nation. All of them stood vulnerable before the conqueror. Jeremiah had spent decades saying that Jerusalem could fall. Now he was about to watch what those words truly meant. And this is where his story enters its darkest hour. Because a prophet can speak about destruction in words, it is another thing to smell the smoke, to see the ruins, to hear the cries, to walk through a city whose stones now carry the weight of every warning ignored. The judgment Jeremiah announced was about to become visible. Not in a vision, not in a scroll, not in a sermon, in fire. The walls had been breached. The king was gone. Zedekiah had been captured on the road near Jericho, taken before Nebuchadnezzar, forced to watch the death of his sons, blinded, bound, and carried toward Babylon. Jerusalem no longer had a functioning king. It no longer had an effective army. Its defenses had failed. The city Jeremiah had warned for decades was now completely exposed. And then came the fire. Babylonian forces moved through Jerusalem with the authority of conquerors. The royal palace was burned, the houses of the city were burned, the walls were torn down, and, most devastating of all, the temple itself was set on fire. For Judah, this was not simply the destruction of a religious building. The temple stood at the center of national memory. It was associated with Solomon, with sacrifice, with priesthood, with festivals, with generations of worship. It had become intertwined with the people's understanding of who they were. And now flames consumed it. The very building that many had once treated as proof that Jerusalem could never fall was being destroyed before their eyes. Jeremiah had warned them, do not trust deceptive words. Do not assume the temple guarantees safety. Remember Shiloh. Sacred space does not make rebellion harmless. Now the warning was no longer a sermon. The temple was burning. This is the point where the entire story of Jeremiah turns from prophecy into history. For years he had spoken in future tense. The enemy will come. The city will fall. The king will be captured. The temple will not protect you. Exile will come. Now the verbs changed. The enemy had come. The city had fallen. The king had been captured. The temple had burned. The exile had become reality. There was nothing left to argue about, no scroll to cut apart, no false prophet to promise a quick reversal, no political faction to insist that Egypt would solve the crisis. No official could accuse Jeremiah of exaggerating what might happen. The devastation itself had become the answer. Yet there is something deeply important about this moment. Jeremiah being proven right was not the same as Jeremiah winning. He had not spent decades waiting for the satisfaction of saying, "I told you so." His message had always been intended to prevent or lessen catastrophe through repentance and obedience. The fall of Jerusalem was not the prophet's triumph. It was his grief. That distinction matters. A prophet who celebrates destruction is not the Jeremiah revealed in Scripture. His identity had been shaped by tears precisely because he loved the people who rejected him. He wanted them to turn. He wanted the king to listen. He wanted the nation to abandon injustice. He wanted false confidence to give way to genuine covenant faithfulness. He wanted the warning to succeed as a warning. But the warning had been rejected until it could no longer function as prevention. Now it functioned as explanation. The ruins told Judah why the prophets had spoken. The city had not collapsed because Babylon was unexpectedly strong. Babylon was strong. But Jeremiah had always insisted that military strength was not the deepest explanation. Judah's fall was the end of a long moral and covenantal trajectory. The seeds had been planted generations earlier. Idolatry had been tolerated. Injustice had spread. Violence had increased. Leaders had repeatedly resisted correction. Kings had trusted power. Priests had trusted institution. Prophets had offered false peace. People had believed that religious identity could substitute for obedience. Josiah's reforms had delayed and restrained certain patterns, but they had not transformed the heart of an entire nation. After his death, the old corruption returned with frightening speed. Jehoiakim rejected prophetic warning. Jehoiachin was carried away. Zedekiah listened, but lacked courage. The people repeatedly chose reassurance over truth. By the time Babylon entered Jerusalem, the physical collapse had been preceded by spiritual collapse for years. That is one of Jeremiah's central lessons. A city may fall in a day, but the decisions that make it vulnerable are often made across generations. The Babylonian commander Nebuzaradan oversaw the destruction. The temple's valuable bronze objects were dismantled and carried away. The great pillars were broken. The bronze sea and other furnishings were taken. Gold and silver vessels were removed. Priests and officials were seized. Some were taken to Riblah and executed. More people were deported. The political, religious, and social structure of Judah was being dismantled, piece by piece. Everything that had made Jerusalem the functioning capital of a kingdom was being removed. A throne without a king, a temple without worship, walls without defense, houses without families, fields without owners. It was the reversal of stability. Judah had once believed possession meant permanence. Now, almost everything visible had become temporary. The fall of Jerusalem created questions that would reshape Israel's faith for generations. If the temple could be destroyed, had God abandoned his people? If the Davidic king was taken away, what had happened to the royal promises? If the land was lost, could covenant identity survive in exile? If Jerusalem was no longer the center of national life, how could the people remain faithful? These questions were not theoretical. They would define the exilic generation. Jeremiah had already prepared an answer. The destruction was real, but abandonment was not the final meaning. The exile was judgment, but it was not the end of the people. The monarchy had failed, but the promise of righteous kingship had not disappeared. The land had been lost, but fields would one day be purchased again. The covenant had been broken, but Jeremiah had spoken of a new covenant. The temple had burned, but the word of God had not burned with it. That last point is especially powerful when we remember Jehoiakim. Years earlier, the king had taken Jeremiah's scroll and thrown it into the fire. He had treated the written warning as though destroying the page could destroy the message. Now, another fire consumed Jerusalem itself. The scroll had been rewritten. The warning had survived. The city that rejected it did not. This is not merely dramatic irony. It exposes a deeper truth in Jeremiah's story. Human beings can reject a message. They cannot always reject the consequences of what the message reveals. The word survived kings. It survived prisons. It survived knives. It survived fire. Jeremiah's own body had nearly disappeared into a cistern, yet the message continued. Now Jerusalem's most powerful institutions had fallen while the prophet still lived. Themselves, the man once treated as the dangerous one had outlasted the structures that condemned him. But again, survival did not feel like victory. The streets around him were filled with loss. Those who had not been killed faced displacement. Families had been torn apart. The economy was shattered. The land was devastated by war. The emotional shock must have been immense. The book of Jeremiah itself does not narrate every personal reaction of the prophet at every stage of destruction, and we should not invent details as certainty. But the tone of his ministry and the broader tradition associated with lament leave no doubt that Jerusalem's suffering was not emotionally distant from him. For Christian and Jewish readers alike, Jeremiah's name became permanently associated with mourning. Traditionally, the Book of Lamentations has been linked with Jeremiah, though the text itself does not explicitly name its author. Whatever conclusion one reaches about authorship, the lament tradition captures the kind of grief generated by Jerusalem's fall. A once crowded city sits desolate. Those who once celebrated now mourn. The sanctuary is devastated. The people ask how such disaster could have come. The images fit the world Jeremiah had warned was approaching, and now that world had arrived. Yet amid destruction, Jeremiah himself received unusual treatment from the Babylonian authorities. Nebuchadnezzar had apparently given instructions concerning him. Nebuzaradan was told to look after Jeremiah, do him no harm, deal with him according to his own wishes. The irony is difficult to miss. Judah's own officials had beaten Jeremiah. Judah's religious leaders had opposed him. His own countrymen had plotted against him. Royal officials had lowered him into a cistern to die. Now the conquering Babylonian authorities recognized him and offered protection. Again, Jeremiah's world overturned expectations. The nation he loved had treated him as an enemy. The empire he had warned would conquer them treated him with a degree of respect. This did not mean Babylon had become righteous. Jeremiah had already proclaimed that Babylon itself would face judgment. The point is narrower. The prophet survived the collapse, and he was given a choice. He could go to Babylon, where he would be cared for, or he could remain in the land with the people left behind. Jeremiah chose to stay. That decision tells us something profound about him. After decades of rejection, he did not abandon Judah when Judah had nothing left to offer him. No royal favor, no protection, no national prestige, no functioning capital, no temple, no political future anyone could clearly see. Jeremiah remained with the remnant. He had loved the people when they mocked him. He remained with them when they were broken. That is not the behavior of a man who had secretly wanted their destruction. He stayed because his calling had never been about winning an argument. It had been about faithfulness to a people in crisis. Babylon appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, as governor over those who remained in the land. The choice carried historical significance. Gedaliah came from a family that had connections with figures favorable to Jeremiah. Years earlier, Ahikam had helped protect Jeremiah when others wanted him killed after the temple sermon. Now, Gedaliah was entrusted with the task of governing the remnant from Mizpah. For the first time after Jerusalem's destruction, something resembling stability became possible. It was fragile, but it existed. Gedaliah urged the people not to fear serving the Babylonians. Settle in the land, gather wine, summer fruit and oil, live in the towns. This advice aligned closely with Jeremiah's long message of accepting Babylonian domination rather than continuing suicidal resistance. Soldiers and scattered groups who had fled during the war began to return. There was a possibility that life could continue. Not the old kingdom, not yet, but community, agriculture, administration, survival. The catastrophe had happened. The question now became, what would the survivors do with what remained? This is where judgment gives way to responsibility. The city was gone, but people were still alive. The monarchy had collapsed, but choices still existed. The remnant could accept the new reality and rebuild slowly. Or it could repeat the same patterns of fear, intrigue, and rebellion that had helped destroy Judah in the first place. Jeremiah had already bought a field as a sign that ordinary life would one day return. Perhaps this small remnant under Gedaliah could become the first fragile step. For a moment, hope seemed possible. The people gathered produce, the land had not disappeared, the soil still yielded. War had devastated Judah, but life persisted in pockets. The future looked reduced, but not extinguished. Then another warning came. Johanan, son of Kareah, and other military leaders approached Gedaliah. They told him that Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, was plotting to assassinate him. Ishmael was not a random figure. He was of royal blood. He had connections to the old political order. According to the account, the king of the Ammonites had sent him with hostile intent. Johanan even offered to kill Ishmael secretly before the plot could be carried out. Gedaliah refused to believe the accusation. He told Johanan not to do it. The warning was dismissed. Once again, the story of Judah stood before a familiar pattern. A warning, a refusal to believe, a threat underestimated. Then consequences. Ishmael came to Mizpah with a group of men. Gedaliah received him. They ate together. And during that gathering, Ishmael and his companions killed Gedaliah. The governor appointed by Babylon was murdered. Others were killed as well. The small structure of stability collapsed almost immediately. The assassination was disastrous, far beyond the death of one man. Gedaliah represented Babylonian authority over the remnant. Killing him could provoke imperial retaliation. Fear spread. The survivors now faced a terrifying possibility. Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem after rebellion. What would Babylon do when its appointed governor was murdered? Ishmael attempted to control captives and move them toward Amon. Johanan and other leaders pursued him. They confronted his group near Gibeon. Many of the captives escaped and joined Johanan. Ishmael himself fled with a small number of men. The immediate danger from him passed, but the larger danger remained. Gedaliah was dead. Babylon could respond. The people panicked, and in panic they turned again toward the old temptation. Egypt. The same Egypt that Judah had repeatedly looked to for political rescue before Jerusalem fell, now appeared as a possible refuge after the fall. Johanan and the surviving leaders gathered the people. They moved toward the area of Bethlehem, preparing to go south. But before crossing into Egypt, they did something that seemed hopeful. They went to Jeremiah. They asked him to pray. Tell us what God wants us to do. The request sounded humble. The people promised obedience. Whether the answer was pleasant or unpleasant, they said they would obey. This was exactly what Jeremiah had been asking Judah to do for decades. Listen first. Obey even when the message is difficult. Perhaps after Jerusalem's fall, the lesson had finally been learned. Perhaps the destruction had broken the cycle. Perhaps the remnant was finally ready to seek truth instead of reassurance. Jeremiah agreed to pray. He promised not to hide anything. Then he waited. 10 days passed. That delay matters. The people were afraid of Babylonian retaliation. Egypt was available. Their instinct was to leave quickly. But the prophetic answer did not come immediately. They had to wait. When Jeremiah finally received the message, it was clear. Stay in the land. Do not be afraid of the king of Babylon. If you remain, you will be built up and not torn down. You will be planted and not uprooted. The language echoed Jeremiah's calling. Decades earlier, he had been appointed to uproot and tear down, to build and plant. Now, after so much tearing down, the remnant was being offered the possibility of planting. Stay. There could still be mercy here. There could still be a future in Judah, but there was also a warning. If they chose Egypt because they believed Egypt would protect them from war, hunger, and danger, the very things they feared would follow them there. Egypt was not a safe alternative to obedience. The message struck at the exact desire driving the people. They wanted certainty. Egypt looked secure. Judah looked ruined. Egypt had cities, resources, political structure. Judah had ashes. From a human perspective, leaving made sense. But Jeremiah told them that their future depended not on which land looked safer, but on whether they obeyed. The pattern had returned one final time. A difficult word, a more attractive alternative, a choice. And what happened next revealed how little the heart had changed. The leaders rejected Jeremiah's message. They accused him of lying. They claimed Baruch had influenced him against them. The same people who had promised to obey whatever answer came now refused the answer because it contradicted what they already wanted to do. This is one of the most painful episodes in the entire book. Jerusalem had fallen, the temple had burned, the king had been taken, the nation had been devastated, and still the fundamental problem remained. The people wanted God's guidance only if it confirmed their plan. They had asked for a word, but they had already chosen Egypt. Their request for guidance had been in effect a request for permission. When permission did not come, they rejected the prophet. Nothing reveals the depth of Judah's spiritual crisis more clearly. Catastrophe alone does not automatically produce repentance. Suffering can humble, but suffering can also harden. The destruction of Jerusalem had changed the people's circumstances. It had not automatically changed their hearts. Jeremiah had warned for decades that the issue was inward. Now the remnant proved his diagnosis again. They went to Egypt, and Jeremiah went with them. The text presents him as being taken along with Baruch and the others. The prophet who had spent his life warning Judah against trusting Egypt now found himself carried into Egypt with the very people who had rejected his final warning. It was a bitter ending to the national journey. Centuries earlier, Israel's foundational story had involved deliverance from Egypt. Now, after covenant rebellion and national collapse, a remnant returned toward Egypt, seeking safety. The direction itself carried symbolic weight. The people were moving backward, not historically in a simple repetition, but symbolically. The nation formed through Exodus was now fleeing into the land associated with its ancient bondage because it trusted Egypt more than the instruction it had received. Jeremiah's ministry was not over. Even in Egypt, he would continue to speak. Even there, he would confront idolatry. Even there, he would warn that geographical escape could not provide spiritual escape. But before following him south, we must remain for a moment in the ruins of Jerusalem. Because this was the great climax of his public ministry. Everything before had moved toward this event. Everything after would be shaped by it. The city fell. The monarchy ended. The temple burned. The people were scattered. Yet Jeremiah survived. Baruch survived. A remnant survived. Exiles already lived in Babylon. The field deed survived in its jar. The promise of restoration survived. The promise of the new covenant survived. The word survived. That is the paradox at the center of Jeremiah's climax. Nearly everything visible was destroyed. The invisible promise was not. Jeremiah had once been appointed to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. For most of his life, the first half of that commission had dominated. Now Judah lay uprooted, Jerusalem lay torn down, the kingdom had been overthrown. The moment had come to ask whether the second half could still be true. Could there be building after this? Could there be planting after exile? Could a people whose heart had resisted warning become a people with the law written upon the heart? Could the line of promise continue without the throne currently standing? Could Jerusalem's destruction become not the death of the biblical story, but a terrible transition within it? Jeremiah believed the answer was yes. But the answer would not come through pretending the ruins were small. The ruins were enormous. The king had lost everything. The city had lost everything. The temple had lost everything visible. The people had been scattered between Babylon, Judah, and now Egypt. This was judgment in its fullest historical form. And yet judgment had not erased promise. That is why Jeremiah's story does not end with fire. The fire explains the warning. It does not complete the message. To complete Jeremiah's story, we must follow what happened after the smoke cleared. We must follow the remnant into Egypt. We must ask what became of the prophet when there was no longer a kingdom left to warn. We must distinguish what Scripture actually tells us about his final days from what later traditions added. And most importantly, we must understand why a man whose generation repeatedly rejected him became one of the most important prophetic voices for generations that came after him. Jerusalem had fallen. Jeremiah had been vindicated. But his greatest legacy would not be that he predicted destruction. It would be that he carried a promise through destruction. The kingdom fell, the prophet remained, and the covenant story moved forward. After the fall, the prophet who could not escape his people, Jerusalem had fallen. The temple had burned. The monarchy had collapsed. Zedekiah was gone. Gedaliah had been assassinated. And the remnant that remained in Judah had rejected Jeremiah's final warning and fled toward Egypt. By every visible measure, the world Jeremiah had known was gone. Yet Jeremiah himself was still alive. This is where his story becomes quieter, but not less important. He was no longer standing before the gates of a functioning temple. He was no longer warning a king seated on David's throne. He was no longer speaking to a nation that still imagined Jerusalem could never fall. He was now traveling with survivors, people who had watched their country disappear, people who had lost homes, relatives, political identity, and security, people who feared Babylon so deeply that Egypt seemed preferable to remaining in the ruined land. And Jeremiah went with them. The biblical text presents the group as taking Jeremiah, Baruch, and others into Egypt, despite the warning they had received. The prophet who had spent decades telling Judah not to trust Egypt was carried into Egypt by the very people who refused to listen. It was a bitter irony, but it was also entirely consistent with Jeremiah's life. He had been rejected before. He had been beaten before. Imprisoned before, ignored before, and still he remained with the people. He could have chosen a different path after Jerusalem's fall. The Babylonian authorities had treated him favorably. He had been offered the possibility of going to Babylon under protection. Instead, he stayed among the remnant. And when that remnant fled south, Jeremiah's story followed them. His calling had never been tied only to Jerusalem as a location. It had been tied to a people. Even when the people became scattered, even when they refused the message, even when they crossed into a land Jeremiah had told them not to enter. Egypt did not end his prophetic voice. At Tahpanhes, Jeremiah spoke again. The people may have believed that by crossing a border they had escaped the danger connected with Babylon. Jeremiah destroyed that illusion. He performed another symbolic act. He took large stones and buried them in clay or pavement near the entrance to Pharaoh's palace at Tahpanhes, in the sight of Judean witnesses. Then he announced that Nebuchadnezzar would extend his power into Egypt as well. The very land they had chosen as refuge would not exist outside the reach of history. The point was not that Egypt would instantly disappear. The point was that fleeing from Judah had not created a guaranteed zone of safety. They had believed geography could solve what obedience had not. Jeremiah insisted it could not. This theme had followed him for years. The temple could not guarantee safety. The walls could not guarantee safety. Egypt could not guarantee safety. Political institutions could not guarantee safety. Empires could not guarantee safety. The only enduring security in Jeremiah's message was found in responding faithfully to God. That had always been the deeper issue. And in Egypt, the conflict returned to the question of worship. The Judean refugees continued practices Jeremiah condemned as idolatrous. In one of the final recorded confrontations of the book, men and women openly defended the worship they had been practicing, including offerings associated with the Queen of Heaven. Their reasoning was revealing. When we practiced these things before, they argued, we had food and prosperity. When we stopped, disaster came. From their perspective, experience proved Jeremiah wrong. The collapse of Judah had not convinced them that idolatry contributed to judgment. They interpreted the collapse in the opposite direction. They believed abandoning those practices had brought misfortune. This is one of the darkest demonstrations of how people interpret suffering. Two people can experience the same catastrophe and draw opposite conclusions. Jeremiah saw Jerusalem's fall as confirmation that Judah had refused covenant correction. The refugees in Egypt used the same fall to defend the very practices Jeremiah condemned. The disagreement was no longer merely about facts. It was about meaning. What did the destruction of Jerusalem actually mean? Had Judah fallen because it had abandoned its gods, or had Judah fallen because it had abandoned the covenant? Jeremiah answered with decades of consistency. The disaster was not evidence that idolatry had protected them. It was evidence that warnings had been ignored. The people reminded Jeremiah that their ancestors, kings, officials, and families had long participated in these practices. That was exactly his point. The rebellion was not new. It had accumulated. Jeremiah told them that God had remembered the evil committed in Judah and Jerusalem. The land had become devastated because correction had repeatedly been refused. Still, many in Egypt declared that they would continue what they had decided to do. The pattern had survived Jerusalem. The walls were gone. The temple was gone. The monarchy was gone. But the resistance of the human heart remained. That is why Jeremiah's new covenant prophecy was so profound. External destruction alone could not produce internal transformation. A city could be burned and people could still resist. A king could be taken away and people could still resist. A nation could be exiled and people could still reinterpret the disaster in order to preserve the beliefs they already preferred. The problem was deeper than institutions. It was deeper than geography. It was deeper than political systems. The problem reached the heart. Jeremiah had been diagnosing that condition from the beginning. Now, near the end of his recorded ministry, the diagnosis was confirmed again. Yet Scripture does not tell us everything that happened afterward. The biblical record becomes quiet concerning Jeremiah's final years. Later traditions developed stories about his death, including claims that he was killed in Egypt. But those traditions should not be presented as though they are explicitly recorded in the canonical biblical narrative. The Bible does not give us a clear scene of Jeremiah's death. It does not tell us his exact age when he died. It does not describe his burial. It does not provide a final dramatic speech at his deathbed. For a man whose life was filled with words, his earthly story ends with surprising silence. And perhaps that is fitting. Jeremiah's importance never depended on the spectacle of his death. His legacy was already larger than his final years. The kingdom he warned had fallen. The exile he predicted had begun. The false assurances he opposed had failed. The new covenant promise remained. And the words preserved through Baruch and the prophetic tradition would continue speaking long after the people who tried to silence Jeremiah were gone. To understand the scale of his legacy, we we must look at what survived him. First, Jeremiah transformed the way later generations understood the fall of Jerusalem. Without the prophetic interpretation, the destruction might have been understood simply as political defeat. Babylon was stronger, Judah was weaker, the empire won, end of story. Jeremiah refused that shallow reading. He placed the catastrophe inside covenant history. The fall had causes beyond military weakness. It had been preceded by generations of warnings. Injustice mattered, idolatry mattered, false worship mattered, corrupt leadership mattered, the refusal to hear mattered. The decisions of kings mattered. The words of false prophets mattered. The moral life of a nation could not be separated from its religious claims. That interpretation became crucial for the exilic community. If Babylon's victory meant Babylon's gods had defeated the God of Israel, then the exile could destroy faith itself. Jeremiah offered another explanation. The fall did not prove that God had been defeated. It proved that covenant judgment had been real. Babylon had not surprised God. The exile had been warned about before it happened. That meant the people could enter exile without concluding that the biblical story had collapsed. Judgment itself existed within the story, and because judgment existed within the story, restoration could also exist within it. This leads to Jeremiah's second great legacy. He taught the exiles how to live without pretending exile was permanent. Build houses, plant gardens, raise families. Seek the welfare of the city. Do not live as though normal responsibility has ended, but also do not confuse Babylon with your final home. This balance would become one of the defining challenges of Jewish life under empire. How do you live faithfully in a place that is not the center of your covenant memory? How do you contribute to the welfare of a foreign society without surrendering identity? How do you accept present circumstances without believing present circumstances are final? Jeremiah's letter gave a framework. Engage, live, work, pray, wait, hope. This was a very different kind of resistance from political revolt. Jeremiah did not tell the exiles to create chaos in Babylon. He told them to build life there, while trusting that history belonged to something larger than Babylon. The empire could control their location. It did not have to control their ultimate identity. That lesson would outlive the empire itself. 3rd Jeremiah gave one of Scripture's most important visions of inward renewal, the new covenant. This promise becomes central because it addresses the recurring failure visible throughout his entire life. Josiah could reform institutions, but he could not rewrite the heart of every citizen. Jeremiah could preach truth, but he could not force people to love it. The law could stand before the nation, but people could break it. The temple could symbolize covenant relationship, but worshipers could enter it while living contrary to that relationship. Therefore, the future Jeremiah described involved something deeper. The law written on the heart, the knowledge of God becoming inward, forgiveness becoming central. For Christian readers, this language becomes especially significant because the New Testament explicitly takes up Jeremiah's words in connection with Jesus and the New Covenant. At the Last Supper, covenant language becomes central to Jesus' interpretation of his approaching death. The letter to the Hebrews quotes Jeremiah's New Covenant passage at length when explaining the significance of the covenant established through Christ. This is an example of a connection supported directly by the New Testament, rather than one imposed artificially onto Jeremiah's story. Jeremiah first spoke hope into the historical crisis of Judah and exile. Later biblical writers saw those words reaching further. The promise that emerged during Jerusalem's darkest hour became part of the Christian understanding of redemption. That is an extraordinary legacy. The prophet who watched a covenant nation collapse became one of the central voices used to explain covenant renewal. But Jeremiah's significance does not depend only on later theological interpretation. His life itself teaches something powerful about faithfulness. By ordinary measures, Jeremiah's ministry could look unsuccessful. Think about it. Did the nation repent as a whole? No. Did Jehoiakim listen? No. Did Zedekiah surrender when Jeremiah told him to? No. Did Jerusalem escape destruction? No. Did the temple survive? No. Did the remnant obey Jeremiah and remain in Judah? No. Did the refugees in Egypt immediately abandon the practices he condemned? No. If success means persuading the majority of your audience to follow your advice, Jeremiah failed. And yet Scripture does not treat him as a failure. Why? Because prophetic faithfulness was not measured by popularity. It was measured by whether he delivered the message entrusted to him. This is perhaps one of the most uncomfortable lessons in his life. Faithfulness and visible success are not always the same thing. Jeremiah spent decades speaking into resistance. He often saw little immediate evidence that his words were changing national behavior. Still, he continued. He dictated the scroll again after Jehoiakim burned it. He continued preaching after being beaten. He spoke after imprisonment. He spoke after being placed in stocks. He spoke after being pulled from the cistern. He spoke after Jerusalem fell. He spoke in Egypt. The continuity is remarkable. A weaker man might have changed the message to gain approval. Jeremiah did not. A more cynical man might have abandoned the people who rejected him. Jeremiah did not. A more self-protective man might have interpreted Babylon's favor as an opportunity to leave Judah behind forever. Jeremiah remained with the remnant. His ministry was painful precisely because truth and love were not opposites for him. He loved Judah enough to warn it. And he warned Judah because love without truth would have become another form of false prophecy. The false prophets offered easier words: peace, quick return, short exile, immediate reversal. Their messages sounded compassionate, but Jeremiah understood that comfort detached from truth becomes cruelty. If a building is burning, telling people there is no fire is not kindness. Jeremiah sounded severe because he believed the danger was real. This is why the image of the physician matters again. Judah had a deep wound. Others treated it lightly. Jeremiah refused superficial healing. That refusal made him unpopular. It also made him useful to generations who later needed to understand what had happened. His story also forces us to reconsider the phrase, the weeping prophet. Jeremiah certainly grieved. His writings contain emotional intensity almost unmatched among the prophets. He lamented his calling. He mourned his people. He wished for eyes that could pour out tears. He experienced loneliness. He complained honestly to God. He sometimes wanted to stop speaking. But the phrase can become misleading if it makes Jeremiah seem fragile or passive. He was one of the most resilient figures in the Hebrew Bible. He confronted kings. He challenged priests. He opposed false prophets publicly. He survived plots. He endured physical abuse. He lived through military occupation. He watched national collapse. Then he continued speaking among refugees. Tears and courage lived in the same man. That is part of what makes Jeremiah so human. Biblical courage is not emotional numbness. Jeremiah felt the cost. He obeyed anyway. His laments also show that biblical faith allows difficult questions. Jeremiah did not hide his confusion behind polished religious language. He asked why the wicked prospered. He complained about deception and opposition. He expressed exhaustion. He described the word within him as fire. At times, his language toward his enemies becomes severe and disturbing to modern readers. These texts should not be erased.
They reveal the emotional extremity of a prophet living under sustained hostility.
Jeremiah's relationship with God included protest as well as obedience. That does not make him less faithful. It shows that faithfulness can include wrestling. The biblical text does not turn its prophet into an emotionless symbol. It allows us to hear the cost. And perhaps that is why Jeremiah's message of hope feels so credible. He did not speak hope because he could not see darkness. He saw darkness more clearly than almost anyone around him. He had named it before it arrived. He had lived inside it when it came. His hope, therefore, had weight. When Jeremiah said houses and fields would be bought again, he had watched houses burn. When he spoke of planting, he had watched a nation uprooted. When he spoke of gathering, he had watched people scattered. When he spoke of forgiveness, he had spent decades naming guilt. When he spoke of a new covenant, he had watched the old covenant repeatedly broken. Hope meant more, because Jeremiah knew what had been lost. And the history after Jeremiah would prove that Babylon was not permanent. The Babylonian Empire eventually fell to the Medo-Persian power under Cyrus. Exiles were permitted to return. Jerusalem would be inhabited again. The temple would eventually be rebuilt. Fields would again be cultivated. The national story would continue. Jeremiah did not live on the assumption that every restoration promise had to be fulfilled immediately within his lifetime. His horizon extended beyond himself. That, too, is part of his legacy. He planted hope for people he might never personally see restored. The field deed preserved in a jar expressed that kind of faith. Jeremiah may not personally enjoy the future harvest, but someone will. This is covenant thinking across generations. The same principle applies to his warnings. Judah inherited consequences shaped partly by previous generations. It also received promises whose fulfillment would bless future generations. Human choices echo forward. That theme runs through Jeremiah's entire ministry. Manasseh's legacy mattered. Josiah's faithfulness mattered. Jehoiakim's rejection mattered. Zedekiah's fear mattered. The false prophet's assurances mattered. The exile's decisions mattered. The remnant's flight mattered. A nation's future was shaped by countless choices interacting across time. Jeremiah helps us resist simplistic explanations. Jerusalem did not fall because of one wicked king. It did not fall because of one bad alliance. It did not fall because one battle was lost. The catastrophe was cumulative. Warnings ignored, compromises repeated. Institutions trusted more than the covenant they represented. Leaders choosing convenience. People preferring reassuring voices. Political fear overriding obedience. By the time the walls broke, the breach was the final visible expression of a much older fracture. The exile did not begin when the walls fell. The spiritual path toward exile had begun far earlier. That insight makes Jeremiah's story relevant beyond the specific politics of ancient Judah, without requiring us to turn every ancient prophecy into a direct prediction about modern nations. Jeremiah's original historical setting should remain central. He spoke to Judah. He addressed kings and communities of his own time. He warned about Babylon. He interpreted covenant failure. We do not need to force his words into modern political headlines to understand their enduring significance. The deeper principles are already powerful. Religious institutions cannot substitute for integrity. National identity cannot substitute for obedience. Popular messages are not automatically true. Fear can destroy leaders who possess information but lack courage. Temporary relief should not always be mistaken for permanent rescue. Consequences can accumulate across generations. Judgment and mercy can exist in the same story. And truth may remain true even when almost everyone rejects the person speaking it. Jeremiah's life also reveals the danger of asking for guidance after already deciding what answer we want. The remnant in Judah demonstrated this clearly. They asked Jeremiah to inquire for them. They promised obedience. Whatever the answer they said, they would follow it. Then the answer came, stay. They wanted go to Egypt, so they accused Jeremiah of lying. That scene is not merely another historical detail, it is the final demonstration of the very problem Jeremiah had preached about from the beginning. The heart can use religious language while protecting its own decision. People can ask for truth while secretly demanding confirmation. They can say they want guidance when what they really want is permission. Jeremiah's ministry repeatedly exposed that gap between appearance and reality, between words and heart, between ceremony and obedience, between confidence and faith, between hearing and doing. This is why the New Covenant promise returns as the right theological conclusion. Judah needed more than another warning. It needed more than another reform. It needed more than another king. It needed transformation at the level Jeremiah had always targeted, the heart. And this is where the entire journey comes full circle. At the beginning, Jeremiah was a young man from Anathoth who said he did not know how to speak. He felt inadequate. He was told that the message would be placed in his mouth. His commission included uprooting and planting. Then came decades of resistance. He preached repentance. He watched reform fade. He confronted Jehoiakim. He dictated the scroll. The king burned it. Jeremiah wrote again. He challenged false prophets. Hananiah broke the wooden yoke. Jeremiah answered with iron. He wrote to the exiles. He told them to build houses in Babylon. He warned Zedekiah. The king listened in secret and refused in public. He was beaten, imprisoned, thrown into a cistern, rescued by Ebed-Melech. He purchased a field during siege. He proclaimed a new covenant while national institutions collapsed. He watched Babylon breach Jerusalem. He lived through the destruction of the city. He remained with the survivors. He warned the remnant not to flee to Egypt. They went anyway, and Jeremiah went with them. The young man who once feared speaking had become the voice that survived the fall of a kingdom. That is the complete arc. But Jeremiah's story is not ultimately about one man being correct. It is about a word that proved more durable than the systems that resisted it. Jehoiakim had power. His reign ended. Zedekiah had a throne. His throne disappeared. The temple had stones. The stones were burned and broken. Babylon had an empire. Its empire would also end. Jeremiah had a message, and the message continued. That is one of the quiet ironies of biblical history. The people who seemed powerless sometimes become the ones whose words endure. The king who cut the scroll into pieces is remembered partly because of the scroll he tried to destroy. The prophet he could not silence is still being read. And the destruction Jeremiah warned about did not erase hope. It purified the meaning of hope. Hope was no longer nothing bad will happen. Hope became, even when consequences come, God's purpose can continue. That is a harder hope, but it is also a stronger one. Jeremiah's final biblical legacy, therefore, cannot be reduced to the phrase prophet of doom. He was a prophet of truth before catastrophe, a prophet of grief during catastrophe, and a prophet of restoration beyond catastrophe. He warned before the fall. He wept through the fall. He carried hope after the fall. Those three movements belong together. Remove warning, and his compassion becomes sentimental. Remove grief, and his judgment becomes cold. Remove hope, and his message becomes despair. Jeremiah held all three: truth, tears, promise. And perhaps that is why his story has endured, not because his generation loved him, many did not. Not because he saw immediate national revival. He did not. Not because his life ended in visible triumph. Scripture does not give us such an ending. His legacy endured because he remained faithful through a transition most people around him could not imagine surviving. A world ended. He continued speaking. A city burned. He continued believing and planting. A covenant was broken. He spoke of a covenant written on hearts. A people were scattered. He spoke of gathering. The monarchy collapsed. He spoke of righteous kingship. Babylon appeared permanent. He knew empires were not permanent. This is the scale of Jeremiah's vision. He could see ruins without believing ruins were the end. For the generations that returned from exile, Jeremiah's words helped explain both why the disaster had happened and why restoration was still possible. For later Jewish readers, his prophecies became part of the enduring scriptural witness formed through the trauma of exile. For Christian readers, his promise of the new covenant became directly connected in the New Testament to the work of Jesus Christ. But in every reading, Jeremiah must first remain what the biblical story presents him as, a prophet to Judah at the edge of national catastrophe. A man called young, a man often rejected, a man emotionally wounded by his mission, a man who did not change his message when rulers became angry, a man who loved a city enough to tell it that its walls could fall, and a man who believed in restoration strongly enough to buy land while an invading army stood nearby. If there is one image that captures Jeremiah's entire life, perhaps it is not the cistern, not the burning scroll, not even the burning temple. Perhaps it is that deed inside the earthen jar. A legal document preserved during siege. A claim on land occupied by an enemy. A small physical statement that says, this devastation is real, but it is not forever. That is Jeremiah. He never asked Judah to pretend judgment was unreal. He asked them to believe judgment was not the final word. Jerusalem did fall. The throne did disappear. The temple did burn. The people did go into exile. The warning became history. But so did the survival of the promise. Jeremiah's generation could silence him temporarily. It could imprison him, mock him, beat him, reject him. It could burn the scroll, but it could not erase the truth. And when the smoke cleared from Jerusalem, one fact remained. The kingdom that refused the warning had fallen, but the promise carried by the weeping prophet was still alive. If you followed Jeremiah's journey to the end, tell us which prophet, king, or biblical book should receive the complete documentary treatment next. Subscribe to continue exploring the Bible as one connected story, and continue with the next episode to see how exile became the setting for another generation of prophets, survivors, and unexpected restoration. Jeremiah's life ended beyond the clear boundary of the biblical record, but his message did not. The city fell, the prophet wept, and the promise continued.